Chapter 11. Malignant aggressiveness, cruelty and destructiveness. Apparent destructiveness. Very different from destructiveness are certain deeply buried archaic experiences that often appear to the modern observer as proofs for man's innate destructiveness. Yet a closer analysis can show that while they result in destructive acts, their motivation is not the passion to destroy. One example is the passion to spill blood, often called bloodlust. For all practical purposes, to shed a person's blood means to kill him, and thus killing and shedding blood are synonyms. Yet the question arises whether there may not be an archaic pleasure in shedding blood that is different from the pleasure in killing. At a deep, archaic level of experience, blood is a very peculiar substance. Quite generally, it has been equated with life and the life force, and is one of the three sacred substances that emanate from the body. The other two are semen and milk. Semen expresses male, while milk expresses female and motherly creativity, and both were considered sacred in many cults and rituals. Blood transcends the difference between male and female. In the deepest layers of experience, one magically seizes upon the life force itself by shedding blood. The use of blood for religious purposes is well known. The priests of the Hebrew temple spread blood from the slaughtered animals as part of the service. The Aztec priests offered their gods the still palpitating hearts of their victims. In many ritual customs, brotherhood is confirmed symbolically by mixing together the blood of the persons involved. Since blood is the juice of life, drinking blood is experienced in many instances as enhancing one's own life energy. In the orgies of Bacchus as well as in the rituals related to Ceres, one part of the mystery consisted in eating the raw flesh of the animal together with the blood. In the Dionysian festivals in Crete they used to tear the ish off the living animal with their teeth. Such rituals are also to be found in relation to many Chthonic gods and goddesses. J. Bryant, 1775. J. G. Bork mentions that the Aryans who invaded India held the native Dasyoo Indians in contempt because they ate uncooked human and animal ish, and they expressed their natural disgust by calling them raw eaters. Very closely related to this drinking of blood and eating of raw meat are customs reported from still existing primitive tribes. At certain religious ceremonies it is the duty of the Hamatsa Indians of northwest Canada to bite a piece of the arm, leg, or breast of a man. That the drinking of blood is considered health-giving can even be seen in recent times. It was a Bulgarian custom to give a man who has been badly frightened the quivering heart of a dove slaughtered at that moment, to aid him in recovering from his fright. J. G. Bork, 1913. Even in as highly developed a religion as Roman Catholicism we find the archaic practice of drinking wine after it has been consecrated as Christ's blood, and it would be a reductionist distortion to assume that this ritual is the expression of destructive impulses, rather than an affirmation of life and an expression of community. To modern man the shedding of blood appears to be nothing but destructiveness. Certainly from a realistic standpoint that is what it is. But if one considers not only the act itself but its meaning in the deepest and most archaic layers of experience, then one may arrive at a different conclusion. By shedding one's own blood or that of another, one is in touch with the life force. This in itself can be an intoxicating experience on the archaic level, and when it is offered to the gods, it can be an ACL of the most sacred devotion. The wish to destroy need not be the motive. Similar considerations apply also to the phenomenon of cannibalism. Those who argue in favor of man's innate destructiveness have often used cannibalism as a major argument to prove their theory. They point to the fact that in the Chukottian caves skulls were found from which the brains had been extracted through the base. It was speculated that this was done in order to eat the brain, whose taste the killers allegedly liked. That is, of course, a possibility, although one that corresponds perhaps more to the view of the modern consumer. A more likely explanation is that the brain was used for magic ritualistic purposes. As indicated earlier, this position has been taken by A. C. Blanc, 1961, who found a strong similarity between the Peking man skulls and those found in Monte Circio dating almost 500,000 years later. If this interpretation is correct, the same holds true for ritualistic cannibalism and ritualistic drinking and shedding of blood. To be sure, non-ritualistic cannibalism was a common practice among primitive people in the last centuries. From all we know about the character of the hunter-food gatherers still living today, or can assume about the prehistoric ones, they were not killers, and it is very unlikely that they were cannibals. As Mumford puts it succinctly, just as primitive man was incapable of our own massive exhibitions of cruelty, torture and extermination, so he may have been quite innocent of manslaughter for food. L. Mumford, 1967. The foregoing remarks are meant as a warning against the hasty interpretation of all destructive behavior as the outcome of a destructive instinct, rather than to recognize the frequency of religious and non-destructive motivations behind such behavior. They were not intended to minimize the outbursts of real cruelty and destructiveness to which we now turn. Spontaneous forms. Destructiveness appears in two forms, spontaneous, and bound in the character structure. By the former I refer to the outburst of dormant, not necessarily repressed, destructive impulses that are activated by extraordinary circumstances, in contrast to the permanent, although not always expressed, presence of destructive traits in the character. The historical record, the most ample and horrifying documentation for seemingly spontaneous forms of destructiveness, are on the record of civilized history. The history of war is a report of ruthless and indiscriminate killing and torture, whose victims were men, women, and children. Many of these occurrences give the impression of orgies of destruction, in which neither conventional nor genuinely moral factors had any inhibitory effect. Killing was still the mildest manifestation of destructiveness. But the orgies did not stop here. Men were castrated, women were disemboweled, prisoners were crucified or thrown before the lions. There is hardly a destructive act human imagination could think of that has not been acted out again and again. We have witnessed the same frenzied mutual killing of hundreds of thousands of Hindus and Muslims in India during the partition, and in Indonesia in the anti-communist purge in 1965, where, according to varying sources, from 400,000 to 1 million real or alleged communists, together with many Chinese, were slaughtered. M. Caldwell, 1968. I need not go further in giving a more detailed description of the manifestations of human destructiveness. They are well known and, besides, often quoted by those who want to prove that destructiveness is innate, as for instance D. Freeman, 1964. As to the causes of destructiveness, they will be dealt with when we shall discuss sadism and necrophilia. I mention these outbursts here in order to give examples for destructiveness that is not bound in the character structure, as is the case with the sadistic and necrophilous character. But these destructive explosions are not spontaneous in the sense that they break out without any reason. In the first place, there are always external conditions that stimulate them, such as wars, religious or political conflicts, poverty, extreme boredom, and insignificance of the individual. Secondly, there are subjective reasons, extreme group narcissism in national or religious terms, as in India, a certain proneness to a state of trance, as in parts of Indonesia. It is not human nature that makes a sudden appearance, but the destructive potential that is fostered by certain permanent conditions and mobilized by sudden traumatic events. Without these provoking factors, the destructive energies in these populations seem to be dormant, and not, as with the destructive character, a constantly flowing source of energy. Vengeful destructiveness. Vengeful destructiveness is a spontaneous reaction to intense and unjustified suffering inflicted upon a person or the members of the group with whom he is identified. It differs from normal defensive aggression in two ways. 1. It occurs after the damage has been done, and hence is not a defense against a threatening danger. 2. It is of much greater intensity, and is often cruel, lustful, and insatiable. Language itself expresses this particular quality of vengeance in the term thirst for vengeance. It hardly needs to be emphasized how widespread vengeful aggression is, both among individuals and groups. We find it in the form of blood revenge as an institution practically all over the world, East and Northeast Africa, the Upper Congo, West Africa, among many frontier tribes in Northeast India, Bengal, New Guinea, Polynesia, in Corsica, until recently, and it was widespread among the North American Aborigines. M.R. Davey, 1929. Blood revenge is a sacred duty that falls upon the member of a family, clan, or tribe who has to kill a member of the corresponding unit if one of his people has been killed. In contrast to simple punishment, where the crime is expiated by the punishment of the murderer or those to whom he belongs, in the case of blood revenge the punishment of the aggressor does not end the sequence. The punitive killing represents a new killing which in turn obliges the members of the punished group to punish the punisher and so on ad infinitum. Theoretically, blood revenge is an endless chain, and in fact it sometimes leads to the extinction of families or larger groups. One even finds blood revenge, although as an exception, among very peaceful populations like the Greenlanders, who do not know the meaning of war, although as Davey writes, the practice is but slightly developed and the duty does not as a rule seem to weigh heavily upon the survivors. M.R. Davey, 1929. Not only blood revenge but all forms of punishment from primitive to modern are an expression of vengeance. K. A. Menninger, 1968. The classic example is the lex talionis of the Old Testament. The threat to punish a misdeed up to the third and fourth generation must also be considered an expression of revenge by a God whose commands have been disobeyed, even though it seems that the attempt was made to weaken the traditional concept by adding "and who will be merciful until the 1000th generation." The same idea can be found in many primitive societies, for instance, in the law of the Yakuts, which says the blood of a man, if spilled, requires atonement. Among the Yakuts, the children of the murdered took vengeance on the children of the murderer to the 9th generation. M.R. Davey, 1929. It cannot be denied that blood vengeance and criminal law, bad as they are, also have a certain social function in upholding social stability. The full power of the lust for vengeance can be seen in those instances where this function is lacking. Thus a large number of Germans were motivated by the wish for revenge because of the loss of the war in 1914 to 1918, or more specifically because of the injustice of the Versailles Peace Treaty in its material conditions, and particularly in its demand that the German government should accept sole responsibility for the outbreak of the war. It is notorious that real or alleged atrocities can ignite the most intense rage and vengefulness. Hitler made the alleged mistreatment of the German minorities in Czechoslovakia the center of his propaganda before he attacked the country. The wholesale massacre in Indonesia in 1965 was initially inflamed by the story of the mutilation of some generals who were opposed to Sukarno. One example of thirst for revenge that has lasted almost 2,000 years is the reaction to the execution of Jesus allegedly by the Jews, the Christ killers, has traditionally been one of the major sources of violent anti-Semitism. Why is vengeance such a deep-seated and intense passion? I can only offer some speculations. Let us consider first the idea that vengeance is in some sense a magic act. By destroying the one who committed the atrocity, his deed is magically undone. This is still expressed today by saying that the criminal has paid his debt, at least in theory. He is now like someone who never committed a crime. Vengeance may be said to be a magic reparation, but even assuming that this is so, why is this desire for reparation so intense? Perhaps man is endowed with an elementary sense of justice. This may be because there is a deep-rooted sense of existential equality. We all are born from mothers. We were once powerless children, and we shall all die. Although man can often not defend himself against the harm others inflict upon him, in his wish for revenge he tries to wipe the sheet clean by denying, magically, that the damage was ever done. It seems that envy has the same root. Cain could not stand the fact that he was rejected while his brother was accepted. The rejection was arbitrary, and it was not in his power to change it. This fundamental injustice aroused such envy that the score could only be evened out by killing Abel. But there must be more to the cause of vengeance. Man seems to take justice into his own hands when God or secular authorities fail. It is as if in his passion for vengeance he elevates himself to the role of God, and of the angels of vengeance. The act of vengeance may be his greatest hour just because of this self-elevation. We can entertain some further speculations. Cruelties like physical mutilation, castration, and torture violate the minimal demands of conscience common to all men. Is the passion for vengeance against those who commit such inhuman acts mobilized by this elementary conscience? Or could it be, in addition, a defense against the awareness of one's own destructiveness by the projective device, they, not I, are destructive and cruel? Answers to these questions require further studies of the phenomenon of vengeance. The considerations offered thus far, however, seem to support the view that the passion for vengeance is so deep-seated that one must think of it as being present in all men. Yet this assumption does not fit the facts. While it is indeed widespread, there are great differences in degree, up to the point that certain cultures and individuals seem to have only minimal traces of it. There must be factors that explain the difference. One such factor is that of scarcity versus abundance. The person or group who has confidence in life and enjoys it, whose material resources may not be ample but sufficient not to elicit stinginess, will be less eager for the reparation of damage than an anxious, hoarding person who is afraid that he can never make up for his losses. This much can be stated with some degree of probability. The thirst for revenge can be plotted on a line at one end of which are people in whom nothing will arouse a wish for revenge. These are men who have reached a degree of development which in Buddhist or Christian terms is the ideal for all men. On the other end would be those who have an anxious, hoarding, or extremely narcissistic character, for whom even a slight damage will arouse an intense craving for revenge. This type would be exemplified by a man from whom a thief has stolen a few dollars and who wants him to be severely punished, or a professor who has been slighted by a student and therefore writes a negative report on him when he is asked to recommend the student for a good job, or a customer who has been treated wrongly by a salesman and complains to the management, wanting the man to be fired. In these cases we are dealing with a character in which vengeance is a constantly present trait. The spontaneous outbreak of lust for revenge, with which we are here mainly concerned, occurs in people who do not have a vengeful character, but in whom extraordinary provocations can whip up intense and sometimes almost compulsive vengefulness. For instance, a normally non-revengeful person may thirst for vengeance against a former member of Hitler's SS who tortured him or killed his wife and children. Ecstatic destructiveness suffering from the awareness of his powerlessness and separateness, man can try to overcome his existential burden by achieving a trance-like state of ecstasy, to be beside oneself, and thus to regain unity within himself and with nature. There are many ways to accomplish this. A very transitory one is provided by nature in the sexual act. This experience may be said to be the natural prototype of complete concentration and momentary ecstasis. It may include the sexual partner but too often remains a narcissistic experience for each of the two, who perhaps share mutual gratitude for the pleasure they have given each other, conventionally felt as love. We have already referred to other symbiotic, more lasting, and intense ways to arrive at ecstasy. We find these in religious cults, such as ecstatic dances, the use of drugs, frenzied sexual orgies, or self-induced states of trance. An outstanding example of a self-induced state are the trance-producing ceremonies in Bali. They are particularly interesting in relation to the phenomenon of aggression because in one of the ceremonial dances, the participants use a kris, a special kind of dagger, with which they stab themselves, and occasionally each other, at the very height of the trance. Obelow, 1960 and V. Monteil, 1970. There are other forms of ecstasis in which hate and destructiveness are the center of the experience. One example is the going berserk to be found among the Teutonic tribes. Berserk means bare shirt. This was an initiation rite in which the male youth was induced into a state of identification with a bear. The initiated would attack people, trying to bite them, not speaking but simply making noises like a bear. To be in this trance-like state was the highest accomplishment of this ritual, and to have participated in it was the beginning of independent manhood. The expression juror lulonicus implies the sacred nature of this particular state of rage. Several features in this ritual are worthy of note. First of all, it is rage for the sake of rage, not directed against an enemy or provoked by any damage or insult. It aimed at a trance-like state which in this case is organized around the all-pervasive feeling of rage. It may be that the induction of this style was helped by drugs. H. D. Fabbing, 1956. The unifying force of absolute hate was required as a means low arrive at the experience of ecstasis. Secondly, it is a collective state based on tradition, the guidance of shamans, and the effect of group participation. Thirdly, it is an attempt to regress to animal existence, in this case that of the bear. The initiates behave like a predatory animal. Ultimately, it is a transitory and not a chronic state of hate. Another example of a ritual that has survived until today and that shows the state of trance organized around rage and destructiveness can be seen in a small Spanish town. Every year on a certain date the men get together on the main square, each with a small or large drum. At exactly midday they begin to beat the drums and do not stop until 24 hours later. After a while they get into a state of frenzy that becomes a state of trance in the process of this continuous beating of the drums. After exactly 24 hours the ritual ends. The skin of many of the drums has been broken, the hands of the drummers are swollen and often bleeding. The most remarkable feature of this process is the faces of the participants. They are the faces of men in a trance and the expression they show is that of a frenzy of hate. It is obvious that the beating of the drums gives expression to powerful destructive impulses. While the rhythm at the beginning of the ritual probably helped to stimulate the trance-like state, after a while each drummer is completely possessed by the passion to beat. This passion takes over completely, and only because of the strength of its intensity are the drummers capable of continuing for 24 hours in spite of their hurting hands and their increasingly exhausted bodies. The worship of destructiveness in many ways similar to ecstatic destructiveness is the chronic dedication of a person's whole life to hate and destructiveness. Not a momentary state as in ecstasis, it has nevertheless the function of taking hold of the whole person, of unifying him in the worship of one goal, to destroy. This state is a permanent idolatry of the god of destruction. His devotee has, as it were, given over his life to him. An excellent example of this phenomenon can be found in the autobiographical novel by E. von Salomon, 1930, one of the accessories to the murder in 1922 of W. Rathenau, the liberal and gifted German foreign minister. Von Salomon was born in 1902, the son of a police officer, and was a military cadet when the German Revolution broke out in 1918. He was filled with burning hate against the revolutionaries, but equally against the bourgeois middle class, which, he felt, was satisfied with the comforts of material existence and had lost the spirit of sacrifice and devotion to the nation. He was at times in sympathy with the most radical wing of the left revolutionaries because they, too, wanted to destroy the existing order. Von Salomon made friends with a like-minded fanatical group of ex-officers, among them Kern, who later killed Rathenau. He was eventually apprehended and sentenced to 5 years in prison. 9 Like his hero Kern, von Salomon may be considered a prototype of the Nazis, but in contrast to most of the latter, von Salomon and his group were men without opportunism or desire for even the comforts of life. In his autobiographical novel, von Salomon says of himself, "I had always my special pleasure in destruction, thus I can feel in the midst of the daily pain an absorbing pleasure in seeing how the baggage of ideas and values has diminished, how the arsenal of idealisms has been ground piece by piece until nothing remained but a bundle of flesh with raw nerves, nerves that like taut strings rendered each tune vibrantly and doubly so in the thin air of isolation." Von Salomon had not always been as devoted to destruction as this sentence would make it appear. It seems that some of his friends, especially Kern, who impressed him tremendously, had influenced him with their own more fanatical attitude. A very interesting discussion between von Salomon and Kern shows the latter's dedication to absolute destructiveness and hate. Von Salomon begins the conversation by saying, "I want power. I want an aim that fills my day. I want life totally with all the sweetness of this world. I want to know that the sacrifices are worthwhile." Kern answers him fiercely, "Damn it, stop your questions. Tell me, if you know it, a greater happiness, if it is happiness that you are greedy for, than the one we experience only by the violence by which we perish like dogs." A few pages later, Kern says, "I could not bear it if greatness could grow again out of the rubble of this time. We do not fight so that the nation is happy, we fight to force it into its line of fate. But if this man, Rathenau, gives the nation a face once more, if he can mobilize it once more to a will and to a form which died in the war, that I could not bear." In answering the question how he, as an imperial officer, survived the day of the revolution, he says, "I did not survive it. I have, as honor commanded, put a bullet in my head on the 19th of November 1918. I am dead. What lives in me is not me. I have not known an I since that day. I died for the nation. So everything lives in me only for the nation. How could I bear it if it were different? I do what I have to do, because I die every day. Since what I do is given only to one power, everything I do is rooted in this power. This power wants destruction and I destroy. I know that I shall be ground to nothing, that I shall fall when this power releases me." We see in Kern's statements the intense masochism by which he makes himself a willing subject of a higher power, but what is most interesting in this context is the unifying force of hate and the wish for destruction that this man worships, and for which he is willing to give his life without hesitation. Whether it was the influence of Kern's suicide before he could be arrested or the political failure of his ideas, it seems that in von Salomon the hope for power and its sweetness gave way to absolute hate and bitterness. In prison he felt so lonely that he could not bear it if the director tried to approach him with human concern. He could not bear the questions of his fellow prisoners in the warmth of the first spring days. "I crawled into my cell which was hostile to me. I hated the guard who opened the door and the man who brought me the soup and the dogs that played in front of the window. I was afraid of joy." He then describes how angry the tree in the courtyard made him when it began to flower. He reports about his response to the third Christmas in prison when the director tried to make the day pleasant for the prisoners in order to help them to forget. "But I do not want to forget. May I be damned if I forget. I want to visualize always every day and every hour of the past." This creates a potent hate. "I do not want to forget any humiliation, any slighting, any arrogant gesture. I want to think of every meanness done to me, every word that caused me pain and was meant to cause pain. I want to remember every face and every experience and every enemy. I want to load my whole life with the whole disgusting dirt, with this piled up mass of disgusting memories. I do not want to forget, but the little good that happened to me, that I want to forget." In a certain sense von Salomon, Kern, and their small circle might be considered revolutionaries. They wanted the total destruction of the existing social and political structure and its replacement by a nationalistic, militaristic order, of which they had hardly any concrete idea. But a revolutionary in a characterological sense is not characterized only by the wish to overthrow the old order. Unless he is motivated by love of life and freedom, he is a destructive rebel. This holds true also for those who participate in a genuine revolutionary movement, but are motivated by destructiveness. If we analyze the psychic reality of these men, we find that they were destroyers and not revolutionaries. They hated not only their enemies, they hated life itself. This becomes very clear in Kern's statement and in von Salomon's description of his reaction to the men in prison, to trees, and to animals. He felt utterly unrelated and unresponsive to anybody or anything alive. The peculiarity of this attitude is particularly striking if one thinks of the attitude of many genuine revolutionaries in their private lives, and particularly in prison. One is reminded of Rosa Luxemburg's famous letters from prison in which she describes with poetic tenderness the bird she can observe from her cell, letters in which no trace of bitterness is to be found. But one need not think only of an extraordinary person like Rosa Luxemburg. There were, and are, thousands upon thousands of revolutionaries in prison all over the world in whom the love of all that is alive never diminished during their years in prison. In order to understand why persons like Kern and von Salomon sought fulfillment in hate and destruction, we would have to know more about their life history. Such knowledge is not available, and we must be satisfied in knowing about one condition for their worship of hate. Their whole world had broken down, morally and socially. Their values of nationalism, their feudal concepts of honor and obedience, these things had lost their foundation in the defeat of the monarchy. Although in the last analysis it was not the military defeat by the Allies, but the victorious march of capitalism within Germany that destroyed their semi-feudal world. What they had learned as officers was now useless, although 14 years later their professional chances would have been excellent. Their thirst for revenge, the meaninglessness of their present existence, their social uprootedness, go far to explain their worship of hate. But we do not know to what extent their destructiveness was the expression of a character structure already formed many years before the First World War. This seems more likely to have been the case with Kern, while I assume that von Salomon's attitude was perhaps more transitional and strongly induced by Kern's impressive personality. It seems that Kern really belongs to the later discussion of the necrophilous character. I have included him here because he offers a good example of the idolatrous worship of hate. One further observation may be relevant for these as well as for many other instances of destructiveness, especially among groups. I refer to the triggering effect of destructive behavior. A person may first react with defensive aggression against a threat. By this behavior he has shed some of the conventional inhibitions to aggressive behavior. This makes it easier for other kinds of aggressiveness, such as destruction and cruelty, to be unleashed. This may lead to a kind of chain reaction in which destructiveness becomes so intense that when a critical mass is reached, the result is a state of ecstasis in a person, and particularly in a group. The destructive character, sadism. The phenomenon of spontaneous, transitory outbursts of destructiveness has so many facets that a great deal of further study is necessary in order to arrive at a more definite understanding than is offered in the tentative suggestions in the previous pages. On the other hand, the data on destructiveness in its character-bound forms are richer and more definite. This is not surprising if we consider that they were gained from prolonged observations of individuals in psychoanalysis and daily life observations, and furthermore, that the conditions that generate these forms of character are relatively stable and of long duration. There are two conventional concepts of the nature of sadism, sometimes used separately, sometimes in combination. One concept is expressed in the term algolagnia, algos, pain, lagnia, lust, coined by von Schrenck-Notzing at the beginning of the century. He differentiated active algolagnia, sadism, from passive algolagnia, masochism. In this concept the essence of sadism is seen in the desire to inflict pain, regardless of any particular sexual involvement. The other concept sees sadism essentially as a sexual phenomenon, in Freud's terms, as a partial drive of the libido, in the first stage of his thinking, and explains sadistic desires that have no overt connection with sexual strivings as being unconsciously motivated by them. A great deal of psychoanalytic ingenuity has been deployed to prove that the libido is the driving force of cruelty, even when the naked eye could not discover such sexual motivations. This is not to deny that sexual sadism, together with masochism, is one of the most frequent and best known sexual perversions. For men afflicted with this perversion, it is a condition for sexual excitation and release. It ranges from the wish to cause physical pain to a woman, for instance, by beating her, to humiliating her, putting her in chains, or forcing her complete obedience in other ways. Sometimes the sadist needs to inflict intense pain and suffering in order to be sexually aroused. Sometimes a small dose will have the desired effect. Many times a sadistic fantasy is sufficient to arouse sexual excitement, and there is no small number of men who have normal sexual intercourse with their wives, but unknown to their partner, need a sadistic fantasy to become sexually excited. In sexual masochism, the procedure is reversed. The excitement lies in being beaten, abused, hurt. Both sadism and masochism as sexual perversions are to be found frequently among men. It would seem that sexual sadism is more frequent among men than among women, at least in our culture. Whether masochism is more frequent among women is difficult to ascertain because of lack of reliable data on the subject. Before starting the discussion of sadism, some comments seem appropriate on the question whether it is a perversion and, if so, in what sense. It has become quite fashionable among some politically radical thinkers, such as Herbert Marcuse, to praise sadism as one of the expressions of human sexual freedom. Marquis de Sade's writings are reprinted by politically radical journals as manifestations of this freedom. They accept de Sade's argument that sadism is a human desire, and that liberty requires that men have the right to satisfy their sadistic and masochistic desires, like all others, if this gives them pleasure. The problem is quite complex. If one defines as perversion, as has been done, any sexual practice that does not lead to the procreation of children, i.e., which only serves sexual pleasure, then of course all those who are opposed to this traditional attitude will arise, and justly so, in the defense of perversions. However, this is by no means the only definition of perversion, and in fact, it is a rather old-fashioned one. Sexual desire, even when no love is present, is an expression of life and of mutual giving and sharing of pleasure. Sexual acts, however, that are characterized by the fact that one person becomes the object of the other's contempt, of his wish to hurt, his desire to control, are the only true sexual perversions, not because they do not serve procreation, but because they pervert a life-serving impulse into a life-strangling one. If one compares sadism with a form of sexual behavior that has often been called perversion, i.e., all kinds of oral genital contact, the difference becomes quite apparent. The latter behavior is as little a perversion as kissing, because it does not imply control or humiliation of another person. The argument that to follow one's desires is man's natural right and hence to be respected is very understandable from a rationalistic, pre-Freudian viewpoint, which assumed that man desires only what is good for him, and therefore that pleasure is a guide for desirable action. But after Freud, this argument sounds rather stale. We know that many of man's desires are irrational, precisely because they harm him, if not others, and interfere with his development. The person who is motivated by the wish to destroy and who feels pleasure in the act of destruction could hardly present the excuse that he has the right to behave destructively because this is his desire and his source of pleasure. The defenders of the sadistic perversion may answer that they are not arguing in favor of the satisfaction of destructive, murderous wishes, that sadism is just one of the many manifestations of sexuality, a matter of taste, and no worse than any other form of sexual satisfaction. This argument overlooks the most important point in the matter. The person who is sexually aroused by sadistic practices has a sadistic character, i.e., he is a sadist, a person with an intense desire to control, hurt, humiliate another person. The intensity of his sadistic desires affects his sexual impulses. This is not different from the fact that other non-sexual motivations, such as attraction to power, to wealth, or narcissism can arouse sexual desire. In fact, in no sphere of behavior does the character of a person show more clearly than in the sexual act, precisely because it is the least learned and patterned behavior. A person's love, his tenderness, his sadism or masochism, his greed, his narcissism, his anxieties, indeed, his every character trait is expressed in his sexual behavior. Sometimes the argument is presented that sadistic perversion is wholesome because it provides an innocent outlet for the sadistic tendencies inherent in all people. According to the logic of this argument, Hitler's concentration camp guards would have been kind to the prisoners if they could have released their sadistic tendencies in their sexual relations. Examples of sexual sadism and masochism. The following examples of sexual sadism and masochism are from The Story of O, by Pauline Reage, 1965, a book that is somewhat less read than de Saude's classics. She rang. Pierre chained her hands above her head, to the chain of the bed. When she was thus bound, her lover kissed her again, standing beside her on the bed. Again he told her that he loved her, then he got off the bed and nodded for Pierre. He watched her struggle, so fruitlessly, he listened to her moans swell and become cries. When her tears flowed, he sent Pierre away. She still found the strength to tell him again that she loved him. Then he kissed her drenched face, her gasping mouth, undid her bonds, laid her down, and left. P. Reage, 1965, O must have no will of her own. The lover and his friends must be in complete control of her. She finds her happiness in slavery and they in the role of absolute masters. The following extract gives a picture of this aspect of sadomasochistic performance. It must be explained that one of the conditions of her lover's control is that she must submit to his friends as obediently as she does to him. One of them is Sir Stephen. Finally she straightened up and, as though what she was going to say was stifling her, unfastened the top hooks of her tunic, until the cleavage of her breasts was visible. Then she stood up. Her hands and her knees were shaking. I'm yours, she said at length to René. I'll be whatever you want me to be. No, he broke in, ours. Repeat after me, I belong to both of you. I shall be whatever both of you want me to be. Sir Stephen's piercing grey eyes were fixed firmly upon her, as were René's, and in them she was lost, slowly repeating after him the phrases he was dictating to her, but like a lesson of grammar, she was transposing them into the first person. To Sir Stephen and to me you grant the right to dispose of her body however they wished, in whatever place or manner they should choose, the right to keep her in chains, the right to whip her like a slave or prisoner for the slightest failing or infraction, or simply for their pleasure, the right to pay no heed to her pleas and cries, if they should make her cry out. P. Reage, 1965. Sadism and masochism, as sexual perversions, constitute only a fraction of the vast amount of sadism in which no sexual behavior is involved. Non-sexual sadistic behavior, aiming at the infliction of physical pain up to the extreme of death, has as its object a powerless being, whether man or animal. Prisoners of war, slaves, defeated enemies, children, sick people, especially the mentally sick, inmates of prisons, non-whites without weapons, dogs, they all have been the object of physical sadism, often including the most cruel torture. From the cruel spectacles in Rome to modern police units, torture has been used under the disguise of religious or political purposes, and sometimes plainly for the amusement of the impoverished masses. The Colosseum in Rome is indeed one of the greatest monuments to human sadism. One of the most widespread manifestations of non-sexual sadism is the abuse of children. This form of sadism has become more widely known only in the last 10 years by a number of investigations, starting with the now classic work of C. H. Kemp, 1962. Since then a number of other papers have been published, and further studies are underway on a national scale. They show that the abuse of children ranges from inflicting death by severe beating or intentional starvation to inflicting swellings and other non-fatal wounds. About the real incidence of such acts we really know next to nothing, since the available data come from public sources, police, for instance, called in by neighbors, and hospitals, but it is agreed that the number of reported cases is only a fraction of the whole. It seems that the most adequate data are those reported by Gill on the nationwide findings of a survey. I shall mention only one of these data. The ages at which children are mistreated can be divided into several periods. 1. From age 1 to age 2. 2. The incidence doubles from age 3 to age 9. 3. From age 9 to age 15 the incidence decreases again to approximately the early level and gradually disappears after age 16. D. G. Gill, 1970. This means that sadism is most intense when the child is still helpless, but is beginning to have a will of its own and to react against the adult's wish to control him completely. Mental cruelty, the wish to humiliate and to hurt another person's feelings, is probably even more widespread than physical sadism. This type of sadistic attack is much safer for the sadist. After all, no physical force but only words have been used. On the other hand, the psychic pain can be as intense or even more so than the physical. I do not need to give examples for this mental sadism. Parents inflict it upon their children, professors on their students, superiors on their inferiors. In other words, it is employed in any situation where there is someone who cannot defend himself against the sadist. If the teacher is helpless, the students often turn into sadists. Mental sadism may be disguised in many seemingly harmless ways: a question, a smile, a confusing remark. Who does not know an artist in this kind of sadism, the one who finds just the right word or the right gesture to embarrass or humiliate another in this innocent way? Naturally, this kind of sadism is often all the more effective if the humiliation is inflicted in front of others. Joseph Stalin, a clinical case of non-sexual sadism. One of the outstanding historical examples of both mental and physical sadism was Stalin. His behavior is a textbook description of non-sexual, as Desaada's novels are of sexual sadism. It was he who was the first to order the torture of political prisoners since the beginning of the revolution, a measure that up to the time of his giving this order had been shunned by the Russian revolutionaries. R. A. Medvedev, 1971. Under Stalin the methods of torture used by the NKVD surpassed in refinement and cruelty anything that the Tsarist police had thought of. Sometimes he personally gave orders about what kind of torture was to be used on a prisoner. He mainly practiced mental sadism, of which I want to give a few illustrations. One particular form Stalin enjoyed was to assure people that they were safe, only to arrest them a day or two later. Of course, the arrest hit the victim all the more severely because he had felt especially safe. Besides that, Stalin could enjoy the sadistic pleasure of knowing the man's real fate at the same time that he was assuring him of his favor. What greater superiority and control over another person is there? Here are some specific examples reported by Medvedev. Shortly before the arrest of the Civil War hero D.F. Serdic, Stalin toasted him at a reception, suggesting that they drink to Bruderskaft. Just a few days before Blücher's destruction, Stalin spoke of him warmly at a meeting. When an Armenian delegation came to him, Stalin asked about the poet Charents and said he should not be touched, but a few months later Charents was arrested and killed. The wife of Orjonikidze's deputy commissar, A. Serebrovsky, told about an unexpected phone call from Stalin one evening in 1937. "I hear you are going about on foot," Stalin said. "That's no good. People might think what they shouldn't. I'll send you a car if yours is being repaired." And the next morning a car from the Kremlin garage arrived for Mrs. Serebrovsky's use. But 2 days later her husband was arrested, taken right from the hospital. The famous historian and publicist Isteklov, disturbed by all the arrests, phoned Stalin and asked for an appointment. "Of course, come on over," Stalin said, and reassured him when they met. "What's the matter with you? The party knows and trusts you, you have nothing to worry about." Steklov returned home to his friends and family, and that very evening the NKVD came for him. Naturally the first thought of his friends and family was to appeal to Stalin, who seemed unaware of what was going on. It was much easier to believe in Stalin's ignorance than in subtle perfidy. In 1938 I.A. Akulov, one-time procurator of the USSR and later secretary of the Central Executive Committee, fell while skating and suffered an almost fatal concussion. On Stalin's suggestion, outstanding surgeons were brought from abroad to save his life. After a long and difficult recovery, Akulov returned to work, whereupon he was arrested and shot. A particularly refined form of sadism was Stalin's habit of arresting the wives and sometimes children of some of the highest Soviet or party functionaries and keeping them in a labor camp, while their husbands had to do their jobs and bow and scrape before Stalin without daring even to ask for their release. Thus the wife of Kalinin, the Soviet Union's president, was arrested in 1937-14 Molotov's wife, and the wife and son of Otto Kusenin, one of the leading Comintern functionaries, all were in work camps. An unnamed witness states that Stalin in his presence asked Kusenin why he did not try to get his son freed. Evidently there were serious reasons for his arrest, Kusenin answered. According to the witness, Stalin grinned and ordered the release of Kusenin's son. Kusenin sent his wife parcels to her work camp, but did not even address them himself but had his housekeeper do it. Stalin had the wife of his private secretary arrested, while her husband remained in his position. It does not require much imagination to visualize the extreme humiliation of these high functionaries who could not quit their positions, could not ask for the release of their wives or sons, and had to agree with Stalin that the arrest had been justified. Either such men had no feelings at all, or they were morally broken and had lost all self-respect and sense of dignity. A drastic example is the reaction of one of the most powerful figures in the Soviet Union, Lazar Kaganovich, to the arrest of his brother, Mikhail Moisevich, who was minister of the aviation industry before the war. He was a Stalinist, responsible for the repression of many people. But after the war he fell out of Stalin's favor. As a result, some arrested officials, who had allegedly set up an underground fascist center, named Mikhail Kaganovich as an accomplice. They made the obviously inspired, and utterly preposterous, assertion that he, a Jew, was to be vice president of the fascist government if the Hitlerites took Moscow. When Stalin learned of these depositions, which he obviously expected, he phoned Lazar Kaganovich and said that his brother would have to be arrested because he had connection with the fascists. "Well, so what?" said Lazar. "If it's necessary, arrest him." At a Politburo discussion of this subject, Stalin praised Lazar Kaganovich for his principles. He had agreed to his brother's arrest. But Stalin then added that the arrest should not be made hastily. Mikhail Moisevich had been in the party many years, Stalin said, and all the depositions should be checked once more. So Mikoyan was instructed to arrange a confrontation between and the person who had testified against him. The confrontation was held in Mikoyan's office. A man was brought in who repeated his testimony in Kaganovich's presence, adding that some airplane factories were deliberately built near the border before the war so that the Germans might capture them more easily. When Mikhail Kaganovich had heard the testimony, he asked permission to go to a little toilet adjoining Mikoyan's office. A few seconds later a shot was heard there. Still another form of Stalin's sadism was the unpredictability of his behavior. There are cases of people whom he ordered to be arrested, but who after torture and severe sentences were released after a few months or years and appointed to high offices, often without explanation. A telling example is Stalin's behavior toward his old comrade, Sergei Ivanovich Kavtaradze, who had once helped him hide from detectives in St. Petersburg. In the 20s Kavtaradze joined the Trotskyite opposition, and left it only when the Trotskyite Center called on its supporters to stop oppositional activity. After Kirov's murder, Kavtaradze, exiled to Kazan as an ex-Trotskyite, wrote a letter to Stalin saying that he was not working against the party. Stalin immediately brought Kavtaradze back from exile. Soon many central newspapers carried an article by Kavtaradze recounting an incident of his underground work with Stalin. Stalin liked the article, but Kavtaradze did not write any more on this subject. He did not even rejoin the party, and lived by doing very modest editorial work. At the end of 1936 he and his wife were suddenly arrested and, after torture, were sentenced to be shot. He was accused of planning, together with Budym Mdivany, to murder Stalin. Soon after sentencing, Mdivany was shot. Kavtaradze, however, was kept in the death cell for a long time. Then he was suddenly taken to Beria's office, where he met his wife, who had aged beyond recognition. Both were released. First he lived in a hotel, then he got 2 rooms in a communal apartment and started to work. Stalin began to show him various signs of favor, inviting him to dinner and once even paying him a surprise visit along with Beria. This visit caused great excitement in the communal apartment. One of Kavtaradze's neighbors fainted when, in her words, the portrait of Comrade Stalin appeared on the threshold. When he had Kavtaradze to dinner, Stalin himself would pour the soup, tell jokes, and reminisce. But during one of these dinners, Stalin suddenly went up to his guest and said, "And still you wanted to kill me." Stalin's behavior in this case shows particularly clearly one element in his character: the wish to show people that he had absolute power and control over them. By his word he could kill them, have them tortured, have them rescued again, have them rewarded. He had the power of God over life and death, the power of nature to make grow and to destroy, to inflict pain and to heal. Life and death depended on his whim. This may also explain why he did not destroy some people like Litvinov, after the failure of his policy of understanding with the West, or Ehrenburg, who stood for everything Stalin hated, or Pasternak, who deviated in the opposite direction from Ehrenburg. Medvedev offers the explanation that in some cases he had to keep some old Bolsheviks alive to support the claim that he was continuing Lenin's work. But surely that could not have been said in Ehrenburg's case. I surmise that here, too, the motive was that Stalin enjoyed the sensation of control by whim and by mood, not restricted by any even the most evil principle. The nature of sadism. I have given these examples of Stalin's sadism because they serve very well to introduce the central issue, the nature of sadism. Thus far we have dealt descriptively with various kinds of sadistic behavior, sexual, physical, and mental. These different forms of sadism are not independent from each other. The problem is to find the common element, the essence of sadism. Orthodox psychoanalysis claimed that a particular aspect of sexuality was common to all these forms. In the second phase of Freud's theory, it was asserted that sadism was a blending of eros, sexuality, and the death instinct, directed outside oneself, while masochism is a blend of eros and the death instinct, directed toward oneself. Against this, I propose that the core of sadism, common to all its manifestations, is the passion to have absolute and unrestricted control over a living being, whether an animal, a child, a man, or a woman. To force someone to endure pain or humiliation without being able to defend himself is one of the manifestations of absolute control, but it is by no means the only one. The person who has complete control over another living being makes this being into his thing, his property, while he becomes the other being's god. Sometimes the control can even be helpful, and in that case we might speak of a benevolent sadism, such as one finds in instances where one person rules another for the other's own good, and in fact furthers him in many ways, except that he keeps him in bondage. But most sadism is malevolent. Complete control over another human being means crippling him, choking him, thwarting him. Such control can have all forms and all degrees. Albert Camus' play, Caligula, provides an example of an extreme type of sadistic control which amounts to a desire for omnipotence. We see how Caligula, brought by circumstances to a position of unlimited power, gets ever more deeply involved in the craving for power. He sleeps with the wives of the senators and enjoys their humiliation when they have to act like admiring and fawning friends. He kills some of them, and those that remain still have to smile and joke. But even all this power does not satisfy him. He wants absolute power. He wants the impossible. As Camus has him say, "I want the moon." It is easy enough to say that Caligula is mad, but his madness is a way of life. It is one solution of the problem of human existence, because it serves the illusion of omnipotence, of transcending the frontiers of human existence. In the process of trying to win absolute power, Caligula lost all contact with men. He became an outcast by casting them out. He had to become mad because, when the bid for omnipotence failed, he was left a lonely, impotent individual. The case of Caligula is of course exceptional. Few people ever have the chance to attain so much power that they can seduce themselves into the delusion that it might be absolute. But some have existed throughout history, up to our time. If they remain victorious, they are celebrated as great statesmen or generals. If they are defeated, they are considered madmen or criminals. This extreme solution to the problem of human existence is barred to the average person. Yet in most social systems, including ours, even those on lower social levels can have control over somebody who is subject to their power. There are always children, wives, or dogs available, or there are helpless people, such as inmates of prisons, patients in hospitals, if they are not well-to-do, especially the mentally sick, pupils in schools, members of civilian bureaucracies. It depends on the social structure to what degree the factual power of superiors in each of these instances is controlled or restricted and, hence, how much possibility for sadistic satisfaction these situations offer. Aside from all these situations, religious and racial minorities, as far as they are powerless, offer a vast opportunity for sadistic satisfaction for even the poorest member of the majority. Sadism is one of the answers to the problem of being born human when better ones are not attainable. The experience of absolute control over another being, of omnipotence as far as he, she, or it is concerned, creates the illusion of transcending the limitations of human existence, particularly for one whose real life is deprived of productivity and joy. Sadism has essentially no practical aim. It is not trivial but devotional. 2 is the transformation of impotence into the experience of omnipotence. It is the religion of psychical cripples. However, not every situation where a person or a group has uncontrolled power over another generates sadism. Many, perhaps most, parents, prison guards, school teachers, and bureaucrats are not sadistic. For any number of reasons, the character structure of many individuals is not conducive to the development of sadism even under circumstances that offer an opportunity for it. Persons who have a dominantly life-furthering character will not easily be seduced by power. But it would be a dangerous oversimplification if I were to classify people into only two groups, the sadist devils and the non-sadistic saints. What matters is the intensity of the sadistic passion within the character structure of a given person. There are many in whose characters sadistic elements can be found, but balanced by such strong life-furthering trends that they cannot be classified as sadistic characters. Not rarely in such individuals the internal conflict between the two orientations results in an enhanced sensitivity toward sadism and in the reactive formation of allergic reactions against all its forms. Traces of their sadistic tendencies may still show up in unimportant, marginal behavior, slight enough to escape awareness. There are others with a sadistic character in whom sadism is at least balanced by countervailing forces, not merely repressed, and while they may feel a certain amount of enjoyment in the control of helpless people, they would not participate in or get pleasure from actual torture and similar atrocities, except under extraordinary circumstances, such as mass frenzy. This can be demonstrated by the attitude of the Hitler regime toward the sadistic atrocities it ordered. It had to keep the extermination of Jews and of Polish and Russian civilians a close secret known only to a small group of the SS elite, but kept from the vast majority of the German population. In many speeches by Himmler and other executors of atrocities, it was stressed that the killings must be done in a humane way, without sadistic excesses, since otherwise it would be too repugnant even to the SS men. In some instances orders were given that Russian and Polish civilians who were to be killed had to be put through a short, formal trial in order to give their executors the feeling that the shooting was legal. While all this sounds absurd in its hypocrisy, it is nevertheless a proof that the Nazi leaders believed that large-scale sadistic acts would be revolting to most otherwise loyal adherents of the regime. A great deal of material has come to light since 1945, but a systematic investigation of the degree to which the majority of Germans were attracted by sadistic acts even though they avoided knowing about them has not yet been made. Sadistic character traits can never be understood if one isolates them from the whole character structure. They are part of a syndrome that has to be understood as a whole. For the sadistic character, everything living is to be controllable, living beings become things. Or, still more accurately, living beings are transformed into living, quivering, pulsating objects of control. Their responses are forced by the one who controls them. The sadist wants to become the master of life, and hence the quality of life should be maintained in his victim. This is, in fact, what distinguishes him from the destroying person. The destroyer wants to do away with a person, to eliminate him, to destroy life itself. The sadist wants the sensation of controlling and choking life. Another trait of the sadist is that he is stimulated only by the helpless, never by those who are strong. It does not cause any sadistic pleasure, for instance, to inflict a wound on an enemy in a fight between equals, because in this situation the infliction of the wound is not an expression of control. For the sadistic character there is only one admirable quality, and that is power. He admires, loves, and submits to those who have power, and he despises and wants to control those who are powerless and cannot fight back. The sadistic character is afraid of everything that is not certain and predictable, that offers surprises which would force him to spontaneous and original reactions. For this reason, he is afraid of life. Life frightens him precisely because it is by its very nature unpredictable and uncertain. It is structured but it is not orderly. There is only one certainty in life, that all men die. Love is equally uncertain. To be loved requires a capacity to be loving oneself, to arouse love, and it implies always a risk of rejection and failure. This is why the sadistic character can love only when he controls, i.e., when he has power over the object of his love. The sadistic character is usually xenophobic and neophobic. One who is strange constitutes newness, and what is new arouses fear, suspicion, and dislike, because a spontaneous, alive, and not routinized response would be required. Another element in the syndrome is the submissiveness and cowardice of the sadist. It may sound like a contradiction that the sadist is a submissive person, and yet not only is it not a contradiction, it is, dynamically speaking, a necessity. He is sadistic because he feels impotent, unalive, and powerless. He tries to compensate for this lack by having power over others, by transforming the worm he feels himself to be into a god. But even the sadist who has power suffers from his human impotence. He may kill and torture, but he remains a loveless, isolated, frightened person in need of a higher power to whom he can submit. For those one step below Hitler, the Führer was this highest power. For Hitler himself, it was fate, the laws of evolution. This need to submit is rooted in masochism. Sadism and masochism, which are invariably linked together, are opposites in behavioristic terms, but they are actually two different facets of one fundamental situation, the sense of vital impotence. Both the sadist and the masochist need another being to complete them, as it were. The sadist makes another being an extension of himself, the masochist makes himself the extension of another being. Both seek a symbiotic relationship because neither has his center in himself. While it appears that the sadist is free of his victim, he needs the victim in a perverse way. Because of the close connection between sadism and masochism, it is more correct to speak of a sadomasochistic character, even though the one or the other aspect will be more dominant in a particular person. The sadomasochist has also been called the authoritarian character, translating the psychological aspect of his character structure into terms of a political attitude. This concept finds its justification in the fact that persons whose political attitude is generally described as authoritarian, active and passive, usually exhibit, in our society, the traits of the sadomasochistic character, control of those below and submission to those above. The sadomasochistic character cannot be fully understood without reference to Freud's concept of the anal character, enlarged by his disciples, especially by K. Abraham and Ernest J. Wunz. Freud, 1908, believed that the anal character manifested itself in a syndrome of character traits, stubbornness, orderliness, and parsimony, to which punctuality and cleanliness were added later. He assumed that this syndrome was rooted in the anal libido that has its source in the anal erogenous zone. The character traits of the syndrome were explained as reaction formations or sublimations of the aims of this anal libido. In trying to substitute the mode of relatedness for the libido theory, I arrived at the hypothesis that the various traits of the syndrome are manifestations of the distance, keeping, controlling, rejecting, and hoarding mode of relatedness, hoarding character. E. Fromm, 1947. This does not imply that Freud's clinical observations with respect to the particular role of everything pertaining to feces and bowel movement was not correct. On the contrary, in decades of psychoanalytic observation of individuals, I have found Freud's observations fully confirmed. The difference lies, however, in the answer to the following: is the anal libido the source of the preoccupation with feces and, indirectly, of the anal character syndrome, or is the syndrome the manifestation of a special mode of relatedness? In the latter case, the anal interest has to be understood as another, but symbolic expression of the anal character, not as its cause. Feces are, indeed, a very fitting symbol. They represent that which is eliminated from the human life process and which no longer serves man's life. The hoarding character is orderly with things, thoughts, and feelings, but his orderliness is sterile and rigid. He cannot endure things to be out of place and has to put them in order. In this way he controls space. By irrational punctuality he controls time. By compulsive cleanliness he undoes the contact had with the world which is considered dirty and hostile. Sometimes, however, when no reaction formation or sublimation has developed, he is not over-clean but tends to be dirty. The hoarding character experiences himself like a beleaguered fortress. he must prevent anything from going out and save what is inside the fortress. His stubbornness and obstinacy is a quasi-automatic defense against intrusion. The hoarder tends to feel that he possesses only a fixed quantity of strength, energy, or mental capacity, and that this stock is diminished or exhausted by use and can never be replenished. He cannot understand the self-replenishing function of all living substance, and that activity and the use of our powers increase our strength while stagnation weakens it. To him, death and destruction have more reality than life and growth. The act of creation is a miracle of which he hears, but in which he does not believe. His highest values are order and security. His motto, "There is nothing new under the sun." In his relationship to others, intimacy is a threat. Either remoteness or possession of a person means security. The hoarder tends to be suspicious and to have a special sense of justice that in essence says, "Mine is mine and yours is yours." The anal hoarding character has only one way to feel safe in his relatedness to the world, by possessing and controlling it, since he is incapable of relating himself by love and productivity. That the anal hoarding character has the close relationship to sadism described by classic psychoanalysts is amply borne out by the clinical data, and it makes little difference whether one interprets this connection in terms of the libido theory or in terms of the relatedness of man to the world. It is also evidenced by the fact that social groups with an anal hoarding character tend to exhibit a marked degree of sadism. LS roughly equivalent to the sadomasochistic character, in a social rather than a political sense, is the bureaucratic character. In speaking here of bureaucrats, I refer to the old-fashioned, cold, authoritarian bureaucrats as they are still found in many old-fashioned schools, hospitals, prisons, railroads, and post offices. Big industry, which is also a highly bureaucratic organization, has developed an entirely different character type, the friendly, smiling, understanding bureaucrat who has perhaps taken a course in human relations. The reasons for this change lie in the nature of modern industry, its need for teamwork, for avoiding friction, for better labor relations, and a number of other factors. It is not as if the new friendly bureaucrats were insincere, as if they were really sadists who smile instead of showing their real faces. In fact, the old-fashioned sadist is not very suited to be a modern bureaucrat, for the reasons just mentioned. The modern bureaucrat is not a sadist turned friendly, but he is a thing to himself, just as other people are things for him. He feels little, either for them or for himself, and his friendly treatment, while not false, is so superficial and thin as to become false. But even this is not quite fair, because nobody really expects it to be more than superficial and thin, except perhaps for the short moment when they both smile and indulge in the delusion that this is human contact. In bureaucratic system, every person controls the one below him and is controlled by the one above. Both sadistic and masochistic impulses can be fulfilled in such a system. Those below, the bureaucratic character will hold in contempt; those above, he will admire and fear. One only has to look at the facial expression and the voice of a certain type of bureaucrat criticizing his subordinate, or frowning when he is a minute late, or insisting on behavior that at least symbolically expresses that during office hours he belongs to the superior. Or one might think of the bureaucrat behind the post office window and watch his hardly noticeable thin little smile as he shuts his window at 5:30 p.m. sharp, while the last two people who have already been waiting for half an hour have to leave and come back the next day. The point is not that he stops selling stamps at 5:30 sharp. The important aspect of his behavior is the fact that he enjoys frustrating people, showing them that he controls them, a satisfaction that is expressed in his facial expression. Needless to say, not all old-fashioned bureaucrats are sadistic. Only a depth psychological study could show what the incidence of sadism among this group is as compared with non-bureaucrats or modern bureaucrats. To mention only some outstanding examples, General Marshall and General Eisenhower, both among the highest-ranking members of the military bureaucracy during the Second World War, were conspicuous for their lack of sadism and their genuine humane concern for the life of their soldiers. On the other hand, a number of both German and French generals in the First World War were conspicuous for the ruthlessness and brutality with which they sacrificed the lives of their soldiers for no adequate strategic purpose. In many cases the sadism is camouflaged by kindness and what looks like benevolence toward certain people in certain circumstances. But it would be erroneous to think that the kindness is simply intended to deceive, or even that it is only a gesture, not based on any genuine feeling. To understand this phenomenon better, it is necessary to consider that most sane people wish to preserve a self-image that makes them out to be human in at least some respects. To be completely inhuman means to be completely isolated, to lose any sense of being part of humanity. Hence it is not surprising that there are many data which make one assume that the complete absence of any kindness, friendliness, or tenderness to any human being creates, in the long run, intolerable anxiety. There are reports of cases of insanity and psychic disorders, for instance, among men who were in the Nazi special formations and who had to kill thousands of people. Under the Nazi regime, a number of the functionaries who had to carry out the orders for the mass killings suffered nervous breakdowns that were called Funktionskrankheit, functionaries' disease. I have used the words control and power in reference to sadism, but one must be clearly aware of their ambiguity. Power can mean power over people, or it can mean power to do things. What the sadist is striving for is power over people, precisely because he lacks the power to be. Many writers, unfortunately, make use of this ambiguous meaning of the words power and control, and in order to smuggle in the praise of power over, they identify it with power to. Moreover, lack of control does not mean lack of any kind of organization, but only of those kinds in which the control is exploitative and the controlled cannot control the controllers. There are many examples from primitive societies and contemporary intentional communities in which there is rational authority based on real, not manipulated consent of all, and where relations of power over do not develop. To be sure, the one who has no power to defend himself also suffers characterologically. He may become submissive and masochistic instead of sadistic. But his realistic powerlessness may also be conducive to the development of virtues like solidarity and compassion, as well as to creativity. Being powerless and hence in danger of being enslaved, or having power and hence being in danger of becoming dehumanized, are two evils. Which is to be shunned the most is a matter of religious and moral or political conviction. Buddhism, the Jewish tradition starting with the prophets, and the Christian Gospels make a clear decision, contrary to contemporary thinking. It is quite legitimate to make subtle differences between power and non-power, but one danger is to be avoided, that of using the ambiguous meaning of certain words to recommend serving God and Caesar simultaneously, or still worse, to identify them. Conditions that generate sadism. The problem of what factors are conducive to the development of sadism is too complicated to find an adequate answer in this book. One point, however, must be clear from the beginning: there is no simple relation between environment and character. This is because the individual character is determined by such individual factors as constitutionally given dispositions, idiosyncrasies of family life, exceptional events in a person's life. Not only do these individual factors play a role, environmental factors are also much more complex than is generally assumed. As I stressed before, a society is not a society. A society is a highly complex system: the old and the new lower middle classes, the new middle classes, the upper classes, decaying elites, groups with or without religious or philosophical moral traditions, small town and big cities. These are only some of the factors that have to be taken into account. No single isolated factor can account for the understanding of character structure as well as of the structure of the society. Therefore, if one wishes to correlate social structure and sadism, nothing short of a thorough empirical analysis of all factors will do. But at the same time it must be added that the power through which one group exploits and keeps down another tends to generate sadism in the controlling group, even though there will be many individual exceptions. Hence sadism will disappear, except as an individual sickness, only when exploitative control of any class, sex, or minority group has been done away with. With the exception of a few small societies, this has not yet happened anywhere in history. Nevertheless, the establishment of an order based on law and preventing the most arbitrary use of power has been a step in this direction, even though this development has recently been arrested in many parts of the world where it once existed and is threatened even in the United States in the name of law and order. A society based on exploitative control also exhibits other predictable features. It tends to weaken the independence, integrity, critical thinking, and productivity of those submitted to it. This does not mean that it does not feed them with all sorts of amusements and stimulations, but only those that restrict the development of personality rather than further it. The Roman Caesars offered public spectacles, mainly of a sadistic nature. Contemporary society offers similar spectacles in the form of newspaper and television reports on crime, war, atrocities, where the contents are not gruesome, they are as unnourishing as the breakfast cereals that are promoted by the same mass media to the detriment of children's health. This cultural food does not offer activating stimuli, but promotes passivity and sloth. At best it offers fun and thrills, but almost no joy. For joy requires freedom, the loosening of the tight reins of control, which is precisely what is so difficult for the anal sadistic type to do. As to sadism in the individual, it corresponds to the social average, with individual deviations above and below. Individual factors enhancing sadism are all those conditions that tend to make the child or the grown-up feel empty and impotent. A non-sadistic child may become a sadistic adolescent or adult if new circumstances occur. Among such conditions are those that produce fright, such as terroristic punishment. By this I mean the kind of punishment that is not strictly limited in intensity, related to specific and stated misbehavior, but that is arbitrary, fed by the punisher's sadism, and of fright-producing intensity. Depending on the temperament of the child, the fear of such punishment can become a dominant motive in his life. His sense of integrity may be slowly broken down, his self-respect lowered, and eventually he may have betrayed himself so often that he has no more sense of identity, that he is no longer he. The other condition for the generation of vital powerlessness is a situation of psychic scarcity. If there is no stimulation, nothing that awakens the faculties of a child, if there is an atmosphere of dullness and joylessness, the child freezes up, there is nothing upon which he can make a dent, nobody who responds or even listens, the child is left with a sense of powerlessness and impotence. Such a powerlessness does not necessarily result in the formation of the sadistic character, whether or not it does, depends on many other factors. Yet it is one of the main sources that contribute to the development of sadism, both individually and socially. When the individual character deviates from the social character, the social group tends to reinforce all those character elements that correspond to it, while the opposite elements become dormant. If, for instance, a sadistic person lives within a group where the majority are non-sadistic and where sadistic behavior is considered undesirable and unpleasant, the sadistic individual will not necessarily change his character, but he will not act upon it. His sadism will not disappear, but will dry up, as it were, for lack of being fed. Life in the kibbutzim and other intentional communities offers many examples of this, although there are also instances where the new atmosphere produces a real change of character. A person whose character is sadistic will be essentially harmless in an anti-sadistic society, he will be considered to be suffering from an illness. He will never be popular and will have little, if any, access to positions in which he can have any social influence. If it is asked what makes the sadism of a person so intense, one must not think only of constitutional, biological factors, S. Freud, 1937, but of the psychic atmosphere that is largely responsible not only for the generation of social sadism but also for the vicissitudes of individually generated, idiosyncratic sadism. It is for this reason that the development of an individual can never be fully understood on the basis of his constitution and his family background alone. Unless we know the location of the person and his family within the social system, and the spirit of this system, we are barred from understanding why certain traits are so persistent and deep-seated. Heinrich Himmler, a clinical case of anal hoarding sadism. Heinrich Himmler is an excellent example of a vicious, sadistic character who illustrates what has been said about the connection between sadism and the extreme forms of the anal hoarding, bureaucratic, authoritarian character. The bloodhound of Europe, as he was called by many, Himmler was, together with Hitler, responsible for the slaughter of between 15 and 20 million unarmed and powerless Russians, Poles, and Jews. What kind of man was he? One may begin by considering a few descriptions of Himmler's character by various observers. Perhaps the most accurate, penetrating characterization of Himmler has been given by K.J. Burckhardt, at the time representative of the League of Nations in Danzig. Burckhardt writes, Himmler impressed one as of uncanny subalternity, subaltimate, narrow-minded conscientiousness, inhuman methodicalness, blended with an element of an automaton. K.J. Burckhardt, 1960. This description contains most of the essential elements of the sadistic authoritarian character described above. It emphasizes Himmler's submissive subaltern attitude, his inhuman bureaucratic conscientiousness and methodicalness. It is not the description of a hater or of that of a monster as the latter is usually conceived, but of an extremely dehumanized bureaucrat. The analysis of Himmler follows mainly the data given by B. F. Smith, 1971, in his excellent biography. Smith used all available data on Himmler including Himmler's 6 diaries, found in 1957, covering the years 1910 to 1922, as well as a few loose diary pages from 1924. Himmler's list of the correspondences he received and sent between 1918 and 1926, Himmler's long, annotated list of his readings, comprising some 270 entries, numerous family documents, and Himmler's own collection of official papers and personal mementos. I have also used the study by J. Ackerman, 1970, which contains a large number of excerpts from the Himmler diaries. And St. Angress and B. F. Smith, 1959. Additional elements of Himmler's character structure are contributed by other observers. A leading Nazi, Dr. Albert Krebs, who was excluded from the party in 1932, spent 6 hours of conversation with Himmler on a railroad train in 1929, that is, when Himmler had little power and noted his obvious insecurity and gaucheness. What made the trip almost intolerable for Krebs was the stupid and basically meaningless chatter with which he intruded upon me all the time. His conversation was a peculiar mixture of martial braggadocio, petit bourgeois small talk, Stammtisch Gesquats, and zealous prophecy of a sectarian preacher. Quoted by J. Ackerman, 1970. The intrusiveness with which Himmler forces another person to listen to his endless chatter, thus trying to dominate him, is typical of the sadistic character. Interesting also is the characterization of Himmler by one of the most gifted German generals, Heinz Guderian. The most opaque of all of Hitler's followers was Heinrich Himmler. This insignificant man, with all signs of racial inferiority, behaved in a simple way. He tried to be courteous. His style of life was, in contrast to Goering's, almost Spartanly simple. But all the more unlimited, Ausschweifender, were his fantasies. After the 20th of July Himmler was plagued by military ambition. This drove him to get himself appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Reserve Army and even Commander-in-Chief of an army group. It was on the military level that Himmler failed first and completely. His judgment of our enemies must be called simply childish. I had occasion several times to observe his lack of self-confidence and of courage in Hitler's presence. H. Guderian, 1951. Another observer, a representative of the German banking elite, Emil Helfa Erich, wrote that Himmler was the type of a cruel educator of the old school, strict against himself but stricter against others. The signs of compassion and especially friendly tone of his thank you letters were all a fake, as one often finds in clearly cold natures. E. Helferich, 1970. A less negative picture is given by Himmler's aide-de-camp, K. Wolf. It mentions only his fanaticism and his lack of will, not his sadism. He could be a tender family father, a correct superior and a good comrade. At the same time he was an obsessed fanatic, an eccentric dreamer and a willing instrument in Hitler's hands to whom he was tied in an ever-increasing love of hate. K. Wolf, 1961. Wolf describes two opposite personalities apparently equally strong, the kind and the fanatic, and does not question the genuineness of the former. Himmler's older brother, Gebhard, describes Heinrich only in positive terms, although the younger brother had hurt and humiliated him long before he was politically powerful. Gebhard even praises the fatherly kindness and care with which he was concerned with the needs and worries of his subordinates. These characterizations include Himmler's most significant character traits: his lifelessness, his banality, his wish to dominate, his insignificance, his submission to Hitler, his fanaticism. His friendly concern for others, mentioned by Wolf and by his older brother, was certainly a behavior trait, but to what extent it was a character trait, i.e., genuine, is difficult to assess. Considering Himmler's total personality, the genuine element in his kindliness must have been very small. As the whole structure of Himmler's character becomes clearer, we shall find that he is indeed a textbook illustration for the anal, hoarding, sadomasochistic character, in which we have already noted over-orderliness and marked pedantry as outstanding traits. Since the age of 15, Himmler kept a record of his correspondence in which he noted every letter he received and wrote. His enthusiasm for these operations and the pedantry and penchant for precise record-keeping that he displayed while engaged in them revealed an important aspect of his personality. His bookkeeper's mentality was most clearly shown in the way he handled the mail he received from Lu and Kf, close friends. The letters he received from his family have not been preserved. On each item he wrote not only the date of receipt but even the precise hour and minute when the letter reached his hands. Since many of these items were birthday greetings and the like, his pedantry went beyond absurdity. B. F. Smith, 1971. Later on, when he was a chief of the SS, Himmler had a card index to record every object he had ever given to a person. B. F. Smith, 1971. At the suggestion of his father he also wrote a diary from the age of 14 to 24. Almost every day one finds meaningless entries to which rarely any deeper thought is added. Himmler noted how long he had slept, when he went to dinner, where he had tea, or whether he smoked, whom he had met during the day, how long he had stayed, to which church he had gone and when he had returned home in the evening. Furthermore he noted who he visited, whether his hosts were nice to him, at what time he had taken the train to return to his parents, whether the train was late or on time. B. F. Smith, 1971. Here is an example of his diary entries in the weeks from August 1 to August 16, 1915, B. F. Smith, 1971. Sunday, bathed, apparently in a lake, or the sea, a third time. Daddy, Ernsty, and I bathed after canoeing for the fourth time. Gebhard was too hot. Monday. Evening for the fifth time bathed. Tuesday, for the sixth time bathed. Friday, bathed a seventh time. Bathed an 8th time. Saturday. Morning bathed for the 9th time. Bathed for the10th time. Morning bathed for the 11th time. After that for the 12th time. Played, then bathed for the 13th time. Played, then bathed for the 14th time. Then bathed for the 15th and last time. Another example is the following. On August 23 of the same year, Himmler noted that 8,000 Russians were taken prisoner at Gumbinnen. On August 28, that there were already 30,000 Russian prisoners taken in East Prussia, and on August 29, that the number of prisoners was not 30,000 but 60,000, and after a still more accurate count, 70,000. On October 4 he noted that the number of Russian prisoners had not been 70,000 but 90,000. He added, "They multiply like vermin." B. F. Smith, 1971. On August 26, 1914, he made the following entry, August 26. Played in the garden with Foch. 1,000 Russians captured by our troops east of the Weichsel. Advance of the Austrians. In the afternoon worked in the garden. Played piano. After coffee we visited the Kissen Baths. We were allowed to pick plums from the tree there. So frightfully many have fallen. We now have 42 centimeter cannons. U. Ackerman, 1970. Ackerman comments that it remains obscure whether Himmler was concerned with the number of eatable plums or the number of killed men. Perhaps some of Himmler's pedantry had been acquired from his father, an extremely pedantic man, a high school teacher, later director, whose main strength seems to have been his orderliness. He was a conservative, basically weak man, an old-fashioned, authoritarian father and teacher. Another outstanding trait in Himmler's character structure is his submissiveness, his subalternity as Burckhardt has called it. Even though he does not seem to have been excessively afraid of his father, he was most obedient. He belonged to those people who submit not because the authority is so frightening but because they are so frightened not of the authority but of life that they seek for an authority and want to submit to it. Their submission has, as it were, an opportunistic quality that is very apparent in Himmler's case. He used his father, his teachers, later his superiors in the army and in the party, from Gregor Strasser to Hitler, to further his career and to defeat his competitors. Until the time that he found in Strasser and the Nazi leaders new and more powerful father figures, he had never rebelled. He wrote his diaries just as his father had told him to, and felt guilty when he missed a day's entry. He and his parents were Roman Catholics. They were regular churchgoers, 3 to 4 times a week during the war, and he reassured his father that he need not worry about his reading immoral books like those of Zola. But there are no signs of religious fervor in the history of young Himmler. His and his family's attitude was a purely conventional one, characteristic of his class. The change of allegiance from father to Strasser Hitler, from Christianity to Aryan paganism, did not occur as a rebellion. It was smooth and cautious. No new step was taken before it was safe to take it. And at the end, when his idol, Hitler, was of no more use, he tried to betray him by attempting to work under new masters, the Allies, the archenemies of yesterday and the victors of today. In this respect lies perhaps the deepest character difference between Himmler and Hitler. The latter was a rebel, although not a revolutionary. The former lacked the rebellious element completely. For this reason there is also no basis for the speculation that Himmler's transformation into a Nazi was an act of rebellion against his father. The real motivation for this change seems to have been different. Himmler needed a strong, powerful guiding figure to compensate for his own weakness. His father was a weak man who, after the defeat of the imperial system and its values, had lost much of his former social prestige and pride. The young Nazi movement, while still not strong when Himmler joined it, was strong in the vehemence of its criticism not only of the left but also of the bourgeois system to which his father belonged. These young people played the role of heroes who own the future, and Himmler, the weak, submissive adolescent, found a more suitable image to submit to than his father was. Simultaneously, he could also look down on his father with some condescension, if not hidden contempt, which was as far as his rebellion went. The most extreme example of his submission was that to Hitler, although one must suspect that his opportunism may have induced him to use a degree of flattery that was not entirely genuine. Hitler was for him the God-man, to be compared to the significance of Christ in the Christian religion or of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. He writes of him, he is destined by the karma of the universal Germanness, malignantum, to lead the fight against the East and to save the Germanness of the world. One of the very great figures of light has found its incarnation in him. J. Ackerman, 1970. He submitted to the new Krishna Christ Hitler as he had to the old Christ of God, except much more fervently. It must be noted, however, that under the circumstances the new gods offered greater opportunities for fame and power. Himmler's submission to a strong fatherly figure was accompanied by a deep and intense dependence on his mother, who loved him and doted on this son. Himmler certainly did not suffer from a lack of love from his mother, a cliché to be found in a number of books and articles written about him. One might say, however, that her love was primitive. It lacked insight or vision into what the growing boy needed. It was the love a mother has for an infant, and it did not change its quality as the boy grew up. Thus her love spoiled him and blocked his growth and made him dependent on her. Before I describe this dependency, I want to point out that in Himmler, as in so many others, the need for a strong father is generated by the person's helplessness, which in turn is generated by his remaining a little boy who longs for his mother, or a mother figure, to love him, protect him, comfort him, and not to demand anything from him. Thus he feels not like a man but like a child, weak, helpless, without will or initiative. Hence he will often look for a strong leader to whom he can submit, who gives him a feeling of strength, and who, in an imitating relationship, becomes a substitute for the qualities he lacks. There was a physical and mental flabbiness in Himmler that is frequently found in such mother's boys and that he tried to overcome by practicing his willpower but mainly by harshness and inhumanity. To him control and cruelty became the substitutes for strength, yet this attempt had to fail since no weakling becomes strong by being cruel, he only hides his weakness temporarily from himself and others, as long as he has the power to control them. There is abundant evidence to show that Himmler was a typical mother's boy. At the age of 17, when he was in military training, away from his parents, he wrote in the first month 23 letters home, and though he received 10 or 12 in reply, he continually complained that the family did not write enough. The first sentence of his letter on January 24 is typical: "Dear Mommy, many thanks for your dear letter. Finally I received something from you." 2 days later, having received another note from home, he starts off in the same vein and adds, "I have waited a painfully long time for it." And 2 letters in 3 days did not stop him from lamenting on the 29th, "Again today I got nothing from you." His early letters combined pleas for mail with complaints about his living conditions. His room was barren and cold, and he suffered from the attentions of bedbugs. He found the food sparse and uninviting and pleaded for packages of food and enough money to allow him to eat at the canteen or the beer hall restaurants in town. Trivial mishaps, such as the inadvertent picking up of the wrong clothes at the bath, assumed the dimensions of minor tragedies and were reported in detail to the family. In part these complaints and lamentations were appeals for help from Frau Himmler. In response, she dispatched a succession of money orders and of parcels containing food, extra bedding, insect powder, and clean laundry. Apparently much advice and many expressions of worry accompanied the provisions that arrived from Landshut. Under the impact of these messages, Heinrich, aware that he must maintain his stance as a brave soldier, would sometimes try to retract the complaint that had set the whole operation in motion. But he always waited until he received the package before changing his tune, and his reserve never lasted long. In the matter of food he was completely unashamed, and his letters are filled with appreciative remarks about his mother's cooking. The Apfelstrudel which I ate after the training session was marvelous, and with requests for snacks such as apples and cookies. B. F. Smith, 1971. As time went by, his letters home became somewhat less frequent, although never falling below 3 a week, yet his requests for mail were as insistent as ever. Sometimes he could get quite unpleasant when his mother did not write him as much as he expected. Dear Mother, he began a letter of March 23, 1917, many thanks for your nice news, which I didn't get. It is really mean of you not to have written. This need to share everything with his parents, especially with his mother, remained the same when he worked as a practicant, a student of agriculture who does practical work on a farm. Then 19 years old, he sent home at least 8 letters and cards in the first 3.5 weeks, although he often noted that he was too busy to write. When he fell sick with paratyphoid fever, his mother was reduced almost to frenzy. On recovery, he spent a good deal of time in writing her all the details about his state of health, his temperature, bowel movements, aches, and pains. At the same time he was clever enough not to want to give the impression that he was a crybaby, interspersing his reports with reassurances that he was fine and chiding his mother for worrying. He even began his letters with 3 or 4 items of general interest and then added, "Now as to how it goes with me, I can see you, dear mother, fidgeting with impatience." F. Smith, 1971. This may have been true, but the sentence is one example of a method Himmler used throughout his life to project his desires and fears on others. Thus far we have made the acquaintance of an obsessively orderly, hypochondriacal, opportunistic, narcissistic young man who felt like an infant and yearned for motherly protection while simultaneously attempting to follow and imitate a father image. Undoubtedly Himmler's dependent altitude, partly generated by his mother's overindulgent attitude toward him, was increased by certain real weaknesses, both physical and mental. Physically, Himmler was not a very strong child and suffered from ill health from the age of 3. At that time he contracted a serious respiratory infection that seems to have settled in his lungs and from which some children had died. His parents were frantic and brought the physician who had delivered the child all the way from Munich to Passau to treat him. To give the child the best care, Frau Himmler went with him to a place with a better climate, and the father visited when he could take time from his work. In 1904 the whole family moved back to Munich for the sake of the child's health. It is worth noting that the father approved of all these measures, which were costly and inconvenient for him, apparently without protesting. At the age of 15 he began to have stomach trouble, which was to plague him for the rest of his life. From the whole picture of this illness it is likely that there was a strong psychogenic factor present. While he resented this stomach trouble as a symptom of weakness, it gave him the chance of being constantly occupied with himself and having people around him who listened to his complaints and fussed over him. Another illness of Himmler's was an alleged heart trouble that was supposed to have been the result of his work on the farm in 1919. The same Munich physician who had treated him for paratyphoid fever now made the diagnosis of a hypertrophied, enlarged, heart due to overexertion during his military service. B. F. Smith comments that in those years the diagnosis of enlarged heart was frequently made and attributed to exertion in the war, and that today most physicians scoff at such diagnoses. Current medical opinion suggests that there was nothing wrong with Himmler's heart, and that aside from problems of insufficient nourishment and the aftermath of the paratyphoid fever, he was probably in reasonably good health. B. F. Smith, 1971. However this may be, the diagnosis must have increased Himmler's hypochondriac tendencies and his ties to his parents, who continued to be worried and concerned. But Himmler's physical weakness went beyond these three groups of illnesses: lung, stomach, and heart. He had a soft and flabby appearance and was physically awkward and clumsy. For instance, when he got a bicycle and could accompany his brother Gebhard on his outings, Heinrich had a penchant for falling off his machine, tearing his clothes, and suffering other mishaps. B. F. Smith, 1971. The same physical awkwardness showed in school and was probably even more humiliating. We have an excellent report on Himmler during his school years by his CO student, G. W. F. Hallgarten, who later became an outstanding historian. In his autobiography, Hallgarten states that when he heard of Himmler's rise to power, he could hardly imagine that this was the same person who had been his classmate. Hallgarten describes Himmler as an extraordinarily milk-faced, plump boy who already wore glasses and often showed a half-embarrassed, half-vicious smile. He was very popular with all teachers and was an exemplary pupil during all his school years, with the best qualifications in all essential subjects. In class he was considered to be over-ambitious, a streber. There was only one subject in which Himmler was deficient, and that was gymnastics. Hallgarten describes in detail how humiliated Himmler was when he was not able to do relatively simple exercises, and was exposed not only to the ridicule of the teacher but also to that of his classmates, who were happy to see this ambitious boy in a position of inferiority. G. W. F. Hallgarten, 1969. In spite of his orderliness, however, Himmler lacked discipline and initiative. He was a talker, and he knew it, berated himself for it, and tried to overcome it. Most of all, he almost completely lacked strength of will. Thus, not surprisingly, he praised a strong will and hardness as ideal virtues, but never acquired them. He compensated for his lack of willpower by his coercive power over others. An illustration of his own awareness of his submissiveness and lack of will is an entry in his diary on December 27, 1919, "God will bring everything to a good end, but I shall not submit without will to fate but steer it myself as best I can." Ackerman, 1970. This sentence is rather tortuous and contradictory. He starts out acknowledging God's will. At that time he was still a practicing Catholic. Then he asserts that he will not submit, but qualifies it by adding without will, thus solving the conflict between his actual submissiveness and his ideal of having a strong will by the compromise that he will submit but with his will. Then he promises himself to steer his own fate, but qualifies this declaration of independence with the lame addition of "as best I can." Quite in contrast to Hitler, Himmler always was and remained a weakling, and he knew it. His life was a struggle against this awareness, an attempt to become strong. Himmler was much like an adolescent who wants to and yet cannot stop masturbating, who feels guilty and weak, accuses himself of his weakness, and is always trying to change and never succeeding. But the circumstances and his cleverness permitted him to gain a position of such power over others that he could live with the illusion of having become strong. Himmler felt not only weak and clumsy physically, but he also suffered from a sense of social inferiority. High school professors were on the lowest level of the monarchical system and were in awe of all the ranks above them. That was all the more acute in Himmler's family, since his father had been for a while the private tutor of Prince Heinrich of Bavaria and had later on kept up enough of a personal relationship so that he could ask the prince to be godfather to his second son, who thus acquired the name Heinrich. With this princely favor granted, the Himmler family had reached the height of their attainable ambitions. The connection would probably have had more favorable consequences had the prince not been killed in battle during the First World War, the only German prince to suffer such a fate. For young Himmler, one might assume, being so eager to hide his sense of worthlessness, the nobility must have seemed like a social heaven barred to him forever. Yet Himmler's ambition achieved the impossible. From the timid, socially inferior adolescent who admired and envied the members of the nobility, he became the head of the SS, meant to be the new German nobility. No longer was there a Prince Heinrich above him, no longer any counts and barons and vons. He, the Reichsführer SS with his underlings, was the new nobleman, at least this must have been his fantasy. Hallgarten's recollections of their school years points up this connection between the old nobility and the SS. There was a group of sons of noble families in Munich, who lived in a house of their own, but went to the same gymnasium for instruction. Hallgarten remembers that they wore a uniform that was like the later SS uniform, with the exception that the color was dark blue instead of the SS black. His suggestion that this uniform served as a model for the later SS uniform seems very plausible. Himmler constantly preached courage and the sacrifice of self for the community. That this was a pretense becomes very apparent in the somewhat complicated history of his wish to join the army and go to the front in 1917. Like his older brother, and many other young men who had connections with the higher echelons of the establishment, Heinrich tried to enter a regiment for officers' training in order to become a cadet, Fähnrich, the lowest rank of commissioned officer. This training had two advantages, the obvious one of achieving officer rank with the hope of continuing as a professional soldier later on, and the less obvious one that this training took a longer time than that of young men who were drafted or volunteered as common soldiers. One could expect that it would take 8 or 9 months before they could be sent to the front. Ordinary soldiers were usually sent to the front much faster at that period of the war. Himmler's older brother Gebhard had already entered officers' training in 1916 and was eventually sent to the front. The fuss made by the family about the older brother and the departure of more and more young people headed for the front made Heinrich Himmler plead with his parents to be allowed to quit school and also enter officers' training. Himmler's father did everything he could to fulfill his son's wish by mobilizing his social connections. But in spite of a warm recommendation from the widow of Prince Heinrich, the regiment to which he was recommended already had sufficient candidates for officers' training and rejected him. The father, in his methodical way, applied to 23 regiments, after having jotted down the names of the top officers of each regiment and the names of important people who might have a connection with a regimental commander. In spite of this he got nothing but refusals. Even then Professor Himmler was not ready to admit defeat. 5 days later he sent a 24th application to The-11th Infantry Regiment, which he had not yet approached. While his father was still fighting the battle of the applications, Heinrich temporarily lost hope, and apparently believed that he might be taken into the service as a common soldier. Using his father's connections, he applied to the city of Landshut for service in the Hilfsdienst, a kind of war work for those who had not been called up by the army. He left school and entered this service, apparently with the hope that in this way he might be deferred for a while from the draft, but when the Bavarian school ministry issued a special order that showed he was in no danger of being drafted, Heinrich re-entered school. Shortly afterwards, much to his and his father's surprise, the 24th application bore fruit, and he was ordered to report in a few days to the 11th Infantry Regiment in Regensburg. At the end of the first week he heard a rumor that he was not going to be kept in officers' training, but was scheduled to be shipped to the front immediately. This tale reduced him to greater depths of gloom and washed away his ardor for combat. B. F. Smith, 1971. While explaining to his parents that he was desperate only because he would not become an officer, he asked them to intervene with a second cousin who was a commissioned officer in this regiment and request his help in the matter. The parents, especially the mother, were almost as terrified as was the boy himself, and a month later Lieutenant Zale, the cousin, was still assuring Heinrich that he was not going to be shipped to the front, urging him to calm down and go through with the program. As soon as his fear of being sent to the front was allayed, Heinrich assumed a position of self-confidence. He dared to smoke, although he had to beg his father for tobacco, and he judged the political situation by commenting on an erroneous report of Ludendorff's resignation that it did not please him. He spent 1918 from the beginning of the year to early October in training and awaiting orders to go to the front. This time he seems to have been very eager to be sent and tried to win special favor with the officers to assure his own assignment in preference to that of his friend Kistler, who was also eager to go to the front, in case only one of them were to be assigned. But these efforts had no result, and so he resumed his social calls and theater visits. The obvious question here is why, at this point, he was eager to go to the front when several months earlier he had been so frightened. There are several answers to this seeming contradiction. His brother Gebhard had been promoted in battle to full cadet, and that must have made Heinrich very jealous and eager to show that he, too, was a hero. It may also be that the competition with Kistler was just enough of a stimulus to make him forget his anxieties through his wanting to beat Kistler in this little game. But it seems to me more likely that the main reason was something else. Just when Heinrich was making these efforts to be sent to the front wrote, "I see the political situation as very black, wholly black. I will never lose my resolve even if there is a revolution, which is not out of the question." B.F. Smith, 1971. Himmler was shrewd enough to know, as almost everybody else knew in Germany in October 1918, that the war was over and lost. It was pretty safe to want to be sent to the front at that time, when the revolutionary wave was already being felt in Germany and 3 weeks later the revolution was to break out in full force. In fact, the rising opposition and revolutionary mood caused the military authorities not to send these young men to the front after all. Another illustration for Himmler's lack of will and his indecisiveness was his professional life. His decision to study agriculture came as a complete surprise, and its motives are still not clear. With the classical education he had received, his family must have expected him to have a profession like his father. The most plausible explanation seems to be that he doubted his capacity for study in a more exacting, intellectual field, and that the study of agriculture seemed to be a way of attaining some academic rank. One must not forget that this choice of agriculture was the result of his disappointment in not reaching his first goal, to become a professional officer in the army. His agricultural career was interrupted by real or alleged heart disease, but this did not stop his intention to continue with it. One thing he did was to learn Russian, because he planned to emigrate to the East and become a farmer. He also seemed to think that eventually the Free Corps would conquer some territory in the East, and there would be a place for him. He wrote, "At the moment I don't know why I am working. I work because it is my duty, because I find peace in work and for my German life's companion with whom one day in the East I'll live and fight through my life as a German, far from dear Germany." B.F. Smith, 1971. And a month later, today, inside myself, I have cut loose from everyone and now depend on myself alone. If I don't find a girl whose character suits mine and who loves me, I'll go to Russia alone. B.F. Smith, 1971. These statements are quite revealing. Himmler tries to deny his fears and loneliness and dependency by an assertion of his strong will. With or without a girl he will live far away from Germany, all by himself, and with this kind of talk he tries to convince himself that he is no longer mother's boy. But actually he behaves like a boy of 6 who decides to run away from mother only to hide around the next corner waiting for her to fetch him. Considering that he was at that time a young man of 20, the whole plan, under the given circumstances, was one of those unrealistic, romantic fantasies to which Himmler was prone when he was not busy in the immediate pursuit of his interests. When it turned out that there was no chance for settling in Russia, he began to learn Spanish with the idea of settling as a farmer in South America. At different times he considered places like Peru, Georgia, USSR, and Turkey, but all these ideas were pure daydreaming. At this point of his life Himmler had nowhere to go. He could not become an officer. He did not even have the money to become a farmer in Germany and much less in South America. He lacked not only the money but the imaginativeness, endurance, and independence this would have required. He was in the same position as many others who became Nazis because they had nowhere to go socially or professionally, and yet were ambitious and had an ardent desire to rise. The hopelessness with regard to achieving an aim, and probably the wish to be far away where nobody would know him, must have been greatly increased by the experience he had as a student in Munich. He became a member of a fraternity and did everything to make himself popular. He visited sick fraternity brothers and sought out members and alumni wherever he went. Yet he was troubled that he was not very popular with his fellow members, some of whom expressed their lack of confidence in him quite openly. His fixed ideas and his continuous organizing and gossiping increased his unpopularity, and he was rebuffed when he tried to be elected to an office in the fraternity. In his relationship to girls he never got beyond his cautious and rigid position, and he put so much distance between himself and the opposite sex that there was soon little danger that his chastity would be threatened. B. F. Smith, 1971. The more desperate his own professional chances became, the more was Himmler attracted by radical right-wing ideas. He read anti-Semitic literature, and when German Foreign Minister Rathenau was murdered in 1922 he was pleased and called him a scoundrel. He became a member of a somewhat mysterious extreme right-wing organization Der Freiweg, and made the acquaintance of Ernst Röhm, an activist in the Hitler Movement. In spite of all these new sympathies and connections with the radical right, he was still cautious enough not to throw his lot completely in with them and remained in Munich and continued his customary life. For despite his politicking, and his torment about himself and his future, many of his habits and old ways, including church attendance, social calls, fraternity dances, and shipments of dirty laundry to his mother, still held fast. B. F. Smith, 1971. He was saved from this professional predicament by an offer of a job, made by the brother of one of his professors. It was that of technical assistant at a nitrogen fertilizer company, where he was assigned to work on the company's research on manure. But strangely enough, it was this very job that led him directly into the field of active politics. The plant in which he worked was in Schleißheim, north of Munich, and it so happened that one of the new paramilitary units, Bund Blücher, had its headquarters there. He could hardly avoid being drawn into this hub of activity, and after much hesitation he eventually joined Hitler's Enstab, one of the more active of competing right-wing groups. It would take too much space to describe the events in Germany and Bavaria at that time. Briefly, the Bavarian government toyed with the idea of turning against the Reich government in Berlin with the help of the right-wing groups, but finally failed to act. In the meantime Himmler left his job in Schleißheim and joined a military unit, a replacement company for a Reichswehr regiment. His company, however, was dissolved by the Reichswehr because there were too many who were willing to participate in an action against Berlin, and thus after only 7 weeks Himmler's new military career was ended. But in the meantime he had made close connections with Rome, and on the day of the Munich Putsch it was Himmler who carried the old imperial war flag, and marched at Rome's side at the head of a column trying to seize the war ministry. Rome and his men surrounded the war ministry, but were in turn surrounded by Bavarian police. Hitler's attempt to relieve Rome had ended in his unsuccessful march against army troops at the Feldherrnhalle. The leaders of the Rome group, Reichskriegsflagge, were taken into custody and Himmler and the rest of the men gave up their weapons, identified themselves to the police, and went home. Himmler, although still impressed with himself for bearing the flag, was both frightened of being arrested and disappointed that the government was not interested in him. He did not dare to do anything that might lead to an arrest, like working with the forbidden organizations. It should be realized that an arrest would not have had any frightful consequences. Most likely he would have been released, or acquitted, or have received a short sentence to be confined to a Festung, like Hitler, a comfortable place with all conveniences, except the right to leave. Instead, he satisfied himself with rationalizations, as a friend, and especially as a soldier and devoted member of the folkish movement. I will never run from danger, but we have a duty to each other and to the movement to hold ourselves in readiness for the struggle. B. F. Smith, 1971. Accordingly, he worked in the Al-Kish movement, which was not forbidden, kept trying to get a job, and toyed with the idea of locating an attractive position in Turkey. He even wrote to the Soviet embassy to inquire if there was any chance of going to the Ukraine, a strange step for this fanatical anti-communist. In this period his anti-Semitism also became more vicious and was sexually tinged, probably because of his continued preoccupation with sex. He speculated about the morals of girls he met and seized upon erotic literature whenever it was available. While visiting old friends in 1924, he found in their library C.F. Schlichtegrull's Ein Sadist im Priestmock, a sadist in priestly attire, which had been banned in Germany in 1904. He raced through it in one day. In general, he presented the picture one would expect as an inhibited and frightened young man who suffered from his inability to relate to women. Eventually the problem of his future was solved. Gregor Strasser, a leader of the National Sozialistische Freiheitsbewegung and its Gauleiter for Lower Bavaria, offered him a job as his secretary and general assistant. He accepted immediately, went to Landshut and rose with Strasser in the party. Strasser represented quite different ideas from those of Hitler. He stressed the social revolutionary features in the Nazi program and was a leader of this more radical wing, together with his brother Otto and Joseph Goebbels. They wanted to move Hitler away from his upper-class orientation and believed the party should proclaim a message of social revolution with only a spice of anti-Semitism. B. F. Smith, 1971. But Hitler did not change his course. Goebbels, knowing which side was stronger, gave up his own ideas and followed Hitler. Strasser left the party, and Röhm, the chief of the SA who also represented more radical revolutionary ideas, was murdered on Hitler's orders, in fact at the hands of Himmler's SS men. The death of Röhm and other leaders of the SA was the beginning and condition of Himmler's own rise to the top. In 1925 and 26, however, the NSDAP was a small party, the Weimar Republic seemed to have become more stable, and Himmler apparently had some doubts. He had lost former friends, and even his parents made it clear that they not only disapproved of his party work but looked on him as the proverbial lost son. B. F. Smith, 1971. His salary was small, and he often had to borrow money. Thus it is not surprising that again the old wish seized him to obtain a solid position as a farm administrator, and that he toyed once more with the notion of emigrating to Turkey. He remained, however, in his party post because all his attempts to find a job remained completely fruitless, not because his loyalty to the ideas of the party was so strong and unswerving. Shortly after, things brightened. Gregor Strasser became Reich propaganda leader for the party in 1926 and Himmler was made his deputy. Only 3 years later Himmler commanded 300 men of the Schulz-Sleiffeln, which by 1933 had grown to an army of 50,000. In his biography of Himmler, Smith comments, "What disturbs us so profoundly is not the organization of the SS nor Himmler's ultimate position as Reich police chief, but the torture of millions of human beings and extermination of millions more." No direct answer to these questions is to be found in Himmler's childhood and youth. B. F. Smith, 1971. I do not believe that he is right and shall attempt to show that Himmler's sadism was deeply rooted in his character structure long before he had the occasion to practice it on the scale that made his name enter history as a bloody monster. We should keep in mind the broad definition of sadism, as the passion for absolute and unrestricted power over another human being. The infliction of physical pain is only one of the manifestations of this wish for omnipotence. We must also not forget that masochistic submissiveness is not the opposite of sadism, but part of the symbiotic system in which complete control and complete submission are manifestations of the same basic vital impotence. One of the earliest indications of Himmler's pleasure in malignant denunciations of other people might be an incident during the war when Himmler was 16 years old. Some well-to-do Saxons who spent a vacation in Bavaria had hoarded food there and sent it home, where such things were much more difficult to obtain. They were denounced in the newspaper, and Smith believes that the wealth of information Himmler had about the items they had bought certainly suggests that he played some part in its exposure. B. F. Smith, 1971. A little poem Himmler wrote in 1919 also expresses his cruel streak. In B. F. Smith, 1971, Franzen, 0 gem null recht echt fui yuka wilde keen pardon gemacht. UNS Recugeln pfeifen und sausen und verbritel yuka schrecken und grauen well weirda so unheimlich hausen. Frenchman, oh pay close attention for there will be no pardon for you. Our bullets will whistle and pass spreading fright and horror among you as we so uncannily do as we wish. From the age of 21 when he felt somewhat more independent because he had begun to find new friends and father figures, he began to be slightly condescending toward his father, although he always couched his preaching in appropriate forms, while the condescending preaching to his older brother Gebhard became increasingly vicious. It is necessary, in order to trace the development of Himmler's sadism, to understand the significance of his relationship to Gebhard. Gebhard was actually the opposite of Heinrich. He was easygoing, popular, unafraid, and attractive to girls. When the two were younger, Heinrich seems to have admired Gebhard, but this admiration changed to bitter envy when Gebhard succeeded in the various things in which Heinrich failed. He went into the war, was promoted on the battlefield, and received the Iron Cross IST class. He fell in love with an attractive girl and became engaged to her while his younger brother, possessing neither glory nor love, was awkward, weak, and unpopular. Heinrich shifted his loyalty from Gebhard to his second cousin Ludwig, who had reasons to feel jealous of Gebhard. At first only criticized his brother caustically for his lack of discipline and purpose, for not being sufficiently heroic, and for being careless as usual, criticizing others for the very vices he himself had. But the future Minister of Police appears fully fledged in his relationship to Gebhard after the latter successfully courted a distant and apparently attractive cousin of theirs named Paula. The girl did not fit Heinrich's idea of a shy, retiring, and chaste fiancée, and unfortunately, there was some trouble between Paula and Gebhard because of an alleged earlier indiscretion on her side. Gebhard wrote Heinrich imploring him to go to Paula's home and help them to settle the question. This unusual request shows to what extent Heinrich had already succeeded in subduing his older brother, probably by intriguing with his parents. Heinrich went to see Paula, but it is not known what happened. The letter he drafted to her a few weeks later, however, after she had apparently made 4 pledges of fidelity, shows us something of his coercive character. I will gladly believe that you will uphold these 4 things, especially as long as Gebhard works directly on you through his personal presence. But that is not enough. A man must have certainty from his bride, even if he is not present for years, and doesn't see her and they don't hear anything from each other for a long time, which in the coming terrible war years only too easily could be the case, that she herself with no word, no glance, no kiss, no gesture, and no thought will be untrue to him. You have a test which you should and must, underlined in the original, be able to withstand, and have in a shameful manner not withstood. If your union is to be a happy one for you two and for the health of das Volk which must be built on sound, moral families you must control yourself with barbaric underlined in the original, strength. Since you do not handle yourself strongly and firmly, and only control yourself to a small degree, and since your future husband, as I have already said, is too good for you, and possesses too little understanding of people and can't learn it since this age won't let it be learned, someone else must do it. Since you both approached me on this affair and drew me in, I feel myself obligated to do it. For the next 7 months Heinrich avoided outright meddling, until in February 1924 he got some kind of information that convinced him, rightly or wrongly, that Paula had again committed an indiscretion. This time he did not even tell his brother, but told the story immediately to his parents and tried to convince them that the family honor demanded an end to the engagement. His mother capitulated and agreed in tears, and eventually he persuaded his father as well, only then did he confront Gebhard directly. When Gebhard agreed to go along and allowed the engagement to end, Heinrich was triumphant and at the same time scornful of his brother's lack of resistance. It was, he said, as if Gebhard had absolutely no soul. This 24-year-old young man had succeeded in breaking down his father, his mother, and his older brother, and in making himself the virtual dictator of the family. The termination of the engagement was especially distasteful to the Himmlers, all the more so because Paula's family was distantly related to them. Yet whenever his parents or Gebhard showed any reluctance about going through with the break, Heinrich was ready to apply more pressure. He visited mutual friends to explain why the engagement must end and in the process tore the girl's reputation to shreds. When a letter arrived from Paula, his response was to stress the need to stand firm and not let oneself be deterred by doubts. At this point the wish to control his brother and parents assumed features of pure sadistic viciousness. He wanted to destroy the girl's reputation, and in order to humiliate the parents, Gebhard, and the girl's family even more, insisted that all presents that had been exchanged must be returned. The father's wish that they end the engagement by mutual consent was turned down by Heinrich, whose hard line triumphed and who eventually rejected all compromise. Himmler had won a total victory and made everybody thoroughly unhappy. In most cases, the story would have ended here, but not so for Heinrich Himmler. He engaged a private detective to watch Paula's conduct and asked him to collect stories that you have heard and which you can prove. The private detective sent him a collection of stories that might have been compromising. Himmler used the occasion to humiliate Paula's family still more by returning some more gifts he had received from the family which he had allegedly forgotten to return before, just adding his visiting card. His final onslaught came 2 months later in a letter to mutual friends. He asks them to tell Paula to stop saying nasty things about the Himmlers and adds the warning that, although he is a nice fellow, I will be completely different if anyone forces me to it. Then, I will not be stopped by any false sense of pity until the opponent is socially and morally ousted from the ranks of society. Italics added. This was the height of vicious control that Himmler could exert under the circumstances. When by his cunning he was able to use the new political circumstances for his own purposes, he had the possibility to act out his sadism on a historical scale. Yet the Reichsführer SS spoke in terms that were not essentially different from those used by the youthful Himmler in his threat to Paula. This is illustrated by Himmler's speech about 20 years later, 1943, about the ethics of the Black Order. One principle must have absolute validity for the SS man: to be honest, decent, loyal, and to be a good comrade to members of our own blood and to nobody else. What happens to the Russians or to the Czechs is a matter of complete indifference to me. What of good blood other peoples have we will take from them by robbing them of their children if necessary, and bringing them up among ourselves. Whether other nations live in prosperity, or whether they perish from hunger, that interests me only inasmuch as we need slaves for our culture, otherwise it does not interest me. Whether in the construction of ditches for panzers 10,000 Russian women fall down Oregon not, interests me only inasmuch as the ditch is ready for Germany. We shall never be cruel and heartless where it does not have to be. U. Ackerman, 1970. In this statement the sadist is free to express himself fully. He will rob other people's children if their blood is good. He will take the older ones as slaves for our culture, and whether they live or die is of no interest to him. The closing of the speech is typical Himmler and Nazi double talk. He protests his moral kindness by assuring his listeners and himself that he is cruel and heartless only if necessary. This is the same rationalization he used already in his threat to Paula: I shall be pitiless if anyone forces me to it. Himmler was a frightened man and always needed rationalizations to embellish his sadism. He may also have needed to protect himself from being confronted with the evidence of his cruelty. Karl Wolff reports that Himmler witnessed a mass execution in Minsk in the late summer of 1941 and was rather shaken by it. But he said, "Nevertheless, I think it is right that we looked at this. Who is to decide over life and death must know what dying is like and what he asks the execution commanders to do." K. Wolff, 1961. Many of his SS men became sick after these mass executions. Some committed suicide, became psychotic, or suffered from other severe mental damage. One cannot speak of Himmler's sadistic character without discussing what has often been described as his kindness. I have already mentioned that he tried to make himself popular by visiting sick fraternity brothers, but he did similar things also on other occasions. He gave an old woman cake and rolls and recorded in his diary, "If I could only do more, but we are ourselves poor devils." Not true, because his family was a well-to-do middle-class family and far from being poor devils. He organized a benefit with his friends and gave the proceeds to Viennese children, and he behaved in a fatherly way to his SS men, as many have commented. From the whole picture of Himmler's character, however, I get the impression that most of these friendly acts were not expressions of genuine friendliness. He had a need to compensate for his own lack of feeling and cold indifference, and to convince himself and others that he was not what he was, or, to put it differently, that he felt what he did not feel. He had to deny his cruelty and coldness by a show of kindness and concern. Even his aversion to hunting animals, which he described as cowardly, could not have been very serious, since he proposed in one of his letters that the hunting of big animals should be facilitated for the SS men as a reward for good conduct. He was friendly to children and animals, but even here skepticism must be permitted, because there is almost nothing this man did that did not have the purpose of furthering his own career. Of course, even a sadist like Himmler can have some positive human traits, like kindness to some people in some situations. One would expect him to have such traits. What makes it so difficult to believe in them in Himmler is his complete coldness and the exclusive pursuit of his selfish goals. There is also a benevolent type of sadism in which control over the other person does not have the aim of harming him, but is meant to work for his own good. It may be that Himmler had some of this benevolent sadism, which often gives the impression of kindness. In his letters to his parents, his condescending preaching has perhaps a benevolent aspect, as has his relationship to his SS men. An example is Himmler's October 16, 1938, letter to a high SS officer, Count Kotelinski: "Dear Kotelinski, you were very sick and had much trouble with your heart. In the interests of your health, I forbid you any smoking for the next 2 years. After these 2 years, you will send me a medical report on your health. After that I shall decide whether the prohibition of smoking will be lifted or will be continued. Heil Hitler." Quoted by H. Heiber, 1958. We find the same tone of the schoolmaster in a letter, October 30, 1942, to the chief physician of the SS, Greuze, who had written him an unsatisfactory report on medical experiments on the concentration camp inmates. This letter should not be the cause of your asking yourself for hours whether I shall fire you as chief physician. it has only the intention to make you give up now after many years your main defect, your vanity, and yet seriously and really to approach all your tasks, also the most disagreeable ones, with courage, and eventually to give up the drive and the opinion that one can get things in order by much talk and chatter. If you learn this and work on yourself, then everything is in order, and I shall then be satisfied again with you and your work. Quoted by H. Heiber, 1958. Himmler's letter to Grawitz is interesting not only for its schoolmasterish tone but also because Himmler admonishes the doctor to give up the very defects which were so clearly his own: vanity, lack of courage, and talkativeness. The collection is full of similar letters in which he plays the role of a strict and wise father. Many of the officers to whom they were written were members of the feudal class, and one may not go far astray if one assumes that it gave Himmler a particular satisfaction to show them his superiority and to treat them like schoolboys. This is no longer benevolent. Himmler's end was as much in line with H's character as H's life had been. When it was clear that Germany had lost the war, he was preparing negotiations with the Western powers, through Swedish intermediaries, which would leave him in a leading role, and offered concessions with regard to the fate of the Jews. In these negotiations he surrendered one by one the political dogmas to which he had clung so tenaciously. Of course, simply by initiating them, der true Heinrich, loyal Heinrich, as he was called, committed the last act of treachery to his idol, Hitler. That he thought the Allies would accept him as the new German Führer was a sign of his mediocre intelligence and lack of political judgment, as well as of his narcissistic grandiosity, which made him think that he was the most important man even in a defeated Germany. He declined the suggestion of General Ohlendorf to surrender to the Allies and to take responsibility for the SS. The man who had preached loyalty and responsibility now showed, true to character, complete disloyalty and irresponsibility. He fled with a black patch over his eye and without his mustache, with false papers, and in the uniform of a corporal. When he was arrested and brought into a prisoner of war camp, his narcissism apparently could not tolerate being treated like thousands of unknown soldiers. He asked to see the commander of the camp and told him, "I am Heinrich Himmler." Some time later Heb ate the cyanide capsule he carried in a hollow tooth. Only a few years earlier, in 1938, he had said in a speech to his officers, "I have no understanding of a person who throws away his life like a dirty shirt because he believes in this way he will evade difficulties. Such a person must be interred like an animal." U. Ackerman, 1970. Thus the circle of his life closed. He had to attain absolute power in order to overcome his own experience of weakness and vital impotence. After he had achieved this aim, he tried to cling to this power by betraying his idol. When he was in a prison camp, as an ordinary soldier, one among hundreds of thousands, he could not bear his reduction to complete powerlessness. He preferred to die, rather than to be thrown back to the role of the powerless man that was for him that of the weakling. To sum up, Himmler is an example of the typical anal hoarding, sadistic, authoritarian character. He was weak, and did not only feel weak, he found a certain sense of security in his orderliness and pedantry, by submitting to strong father images, and eventually he developed a passion for unlimited control over others as the one way to overcome his sense of vital impotence, shyness, uneasiness. He was extremely envious of others whom life had endowed with more strength and self-esteem. His vital impotence and the resulting envy led to the malicious wish to humiliate and destroy them, whether it was his brother Gebhard's fiancée or the Jews. He was utterly cold and without mercy, which made him feel more isolated and more frightened. Himmler was also an absolute opportunist. His sadistic passion was always governed by what he thought was advantageous for him. He was disloyal and an inveterate liar not only toward others, but equally toward himself. Every one of the virtues he eternally preached was conspicuous by its absence within himself. He coined the SS motto, loyalty is our honor, and betrayed Hitler. He preached strength, firmness, and courage, yet he was weak, flabby, and cowardly. The true Heinrich was a living lie. Perhaps the only true thing he ever said about himself was a sentence he wrote to his father while he was in military training: "Have no fears on my account because I am sly as a fox." B. F. Smith, 1971. A behaviorist might still ask whether Himmler was not a normal man until circumstances made it advantageous for him to act sadistically. I believe our analysis has already answered this question. We have seen that all the conditions for a sadistic development were given in his earlier development. We have followed the development of his early insecurity, unmanliness, cowardice, sense of impotence, and these attributes alone would indicate the probability of sadistic compensations. Moreover, we have seen the development of his over-orderly, pedantic, typically anal-hoarding, authoritarian character. Eventually we have seen his overt pernicious sadism in dealing with his brother's fiancée, long before he had any power. We must come to the conclusion that the Reichsführer SS was a sadistic character before he was a Reichsführer. His position gave him the power to act out his sadism on the historical stage, but the sadism was there before. This question leads to another that has often been raised: what would have become of Himmler had he not been born at the time of the Nazi power, yet endowed with the same character he had at the time of his intervention with his brother's engagement? The answer is not too difficult to find. Since he was of average intelligence and very orderly, he probably would have found a place in a bureaucratic system, say as a school teacher, postal clerk, or employee in a large business enterprise. Since he ruthlessly sought his advantage, by cleverly flattering his superiors and intriguing against his colleagues, he might have risen to quite a high position, probably not to a top position because he lacked any constructive imagination or good judgment. He would have been thoroughly disliked by his colleagues and perhaps would have become the favorite of a powerful superior. He would have made a good agent for Ford, in Henry Ford's anti-union days, but hardly a good personnel chief in a modern corporation, because his coldness would have made him too unpopular. At his funeral his boss and the minister would have eulogized him as a kind father and husband, a responsible citizen whose selfless services as a church warden would always remain an example and an inspiration. There are thousands of Himmlers living among us. Socially speaking, they do only minor harm in normal life, although one must not underestimate the number of people whom they damage and make thoroughly unhappy. But when forces of destruction and hate threaten to engulf the whole body politic, such people become extremely dangerous. They are the ones who yearn to serve the government as its agents for terror, for torture, and killing. Many people commit the severe error of believing that one can easily recognize a potential Himmler from far away. One of the purposes of characterological studies is to show that the potential Himmler looks like anybody else, except to those who have learned to read character and who do not have to wait until circumstances permit the monster to show his colors. What are the factors that made Himmler a merciless sadist? A simple answer could be found by referring to our previous discussion of the factors that tend to produce the hoarding character. But this would not be a satisfactory answer because Himmler's character presented an extreme and very malignant form of the hoarding character, which is much less frequent than the only slightly sadistic hoarder. If we try to look for the factors responsible for the character development of the Bloodhound of Europe, we first run across his relationship to his parents. He was bound to his mother who encouraged his dependency, and he had an authoritarian, rather weak father. But are there not millions who have the same antecedents and who do not become Himmlers? Indeed, one or two isolated factors can never explain a person's specific character. Only a whole system of interrelated factors can more or less fully account for character development. In Himmler we have seen some other factors: his physical weakness and awkwardness, perhaps generated by a number of physical illnesses and an impaired constitution, his sense of social inferiority based on his social fringe position, increased by his father's submissive and worshipful attitude toward the aristocracy, his timidity toward women, which may have had its cause in his fixation to his mother that made him feel helpless and unmanly, his extreme narcissism and jealousy of his older brother, who had all the qualities Himmler lacked. There are numerous other factors we have not touched upon, partly because of lack of information, that would give us a fuller picture. We must also consider that there may be genetically determined factors that, while not the source of sadism, are responsible for a disposition toward it. But perhaps more than of any other factor we must think of the pathogenic influence of the dry, banal, pedantic, dishonest, unalive atmosphere in which the Himmler family lived. There were no values except the insincere profession of patriotism and honesty. There was no hope except that of managing to hold on to their precarious position on the social ladder. There was no fresh air, spiritually or mentally, that could have encouraged the weak little boy to branch out and develop. And there was not only this family. The Himmlers were part of a social class on the lowest fringe of the imperial system that suffered from resentment, impotence, and joylessness. This was the soil on which Himmler grew, and he became increasingly more vicious as the revolution defeated his social status and values, and as it became clearer to him that he had no future in professional terms. Chapter 12. Malignant Aggression, Necrophilia. The traditional concept. The term necrophilia, love of the dead, has been applied generally only to two kinds of phenomena. 1. Sexual necrophilia, a man's desire to have sexual intercourse or any other kind of sexual contact with a female corpse, and 2. Non-sexual necrophilia, the desire to handle, to be near to, and to gaze at corpses, and particularly the desire to dismember them, but the term has generally not been applied to a character-rooted passion, the soil in which its more overt and cruder manifestation grows. A look at some examples of necrophilia in the traditional sense will make it easier to identify the less obvious necrophilous character. Reports on cases of necrophilia can be found in a number of works, especially those on sexual perversions and criminology. The most complete selection is given by H. von Hentig, one of the foremost German criminologists, in a work dealing exclusively with this subject. In German as well as in the criminal law of other countries, necrophilia constitutes a crime. He cites as examples of necrophilia, 1. Acts of sexual contact with a female corpse, intercourse, manipulation of sexual organs, 2. Sexual excitement produced by the sight of a woman's corpse, 3. Attraction to corpses and graves and to objects connected with the grave, such as flowers or pictures, 4. Acts of dismemberment of a corpse, and 5. The craving to touch or to smell the odor of corpses or anything putrid. H. von Hentig, 1964. Von Hentig shares the opinion of other authors, such as T. Spory, 1959, whom he quotes, that necrophilia is much more frequent than is generally assumed. For practical reasons, however, this perversion meets with very limited possibilities for satisfaction. The only people who have easy access to corpses and the opportunity to act out such a perversion are grave diggers and morgue attendants. Thus it is not surprising to find that most examples given deal with this group of people. Of course, it is also possible that these occupations may in themselves tend to attract necrophilous persons. Murderers, of course, also have the opportunity to practice necrophilia, but considering that murder used to be relatively rare, we cannot expect to find many instances in this category, except in some of those cases classified as lust murder. However, von Hentig quotes a number of examples in which outsiders have dug up corpses, abducted them, and used them sexually to satisfy their necrophilous craving. The conclusion is unavoidable that since necrophilia is relatively frequent among those who have an easy opportunity, it must also be present, at least in fantasies or acted out in other, less obvious ways, in many others who lack this opportunity. This is a case history of a 21-year-old morgue attendant reported by J.P. de River. At the age of 18 he fell in love with a girl with whom he had sexual intercourse just once, because she was in poor health, pulmonary tuberculosis. He states, "I have never gotten over the death of my sweetheart, and whenever I commit the act of masturbation, I visualize having sexual intercourse with my dead sweetheart." De River's report continues, "Upon the death of his sweetheart, he was so emotionally upset at seeing her laid out in a white shroud that he had a crying spell, and he allowed himself to be removed from the side of the casket with great reluctance. At this time he felt an urge to jump into the casket with her, and he actually wanted to be buried alive with his sweetheart. He created quite a scene at the burial. In some countries it is customary to exhibit a portrait of the deceased on the grave." Malignant aggression. Necrophilia, including his family, thought this was the result of his great grief at seeing her laid away, but he now comes to realize that it was a fit of passion and that he was overcome with a great sexual urge at the sight of the deceased. At that time, he had just completed his last year in high school, and he tried to prevail upon his mother to allow him to enter medical school, but because of lack of funds he was unable to do so. However, at his suggestion, she allowed him to enter a school of undertaking and embalming, because the course was much cheaper and shorter. D.W. studied very hard at this school, realizing at last that he had found a profession in which he would be most happy. He was always intensely interested in the female bodies in the embalming room, and on numerous occasions he had a great desire to have an act of sexual intercourse with a female cadaver. He realized that this was wrong and fought the desire off on numerous occasions until one day, near the completion of his studies, when he was alone in the room with the body of a young girl, the urge to commit an act of sexual intercourse upon the body of the deceased victim was so great and the circumstances so ideal he let himself go. He took advantage of this opportunity and exposed his privates, touching his penis to her thigh, at which time he became greatly excited. Losing control of himself, he leaped upon the body and copulated his mouth to the private parts of the cadaver. He states that this caused him such sexual stimulation that he had a seminal emission. He was then seized with great remorse and the fear of being detected and found out by his fellow students. Shortly after the commission of this act, he graduated from the school, and secured a position as morgue attendant in a Midwestern city. As he was the junior member of the staff of morgue attendants, he was frequently called upon to remain alone in the morgue at night. D.W. states, "I was glad of the opportunity of being alone, as I had come to realize that I was different from other men, in that I longed to be alone with the dead, and this would give me ample opportunity to attempt an act of coitus with a corpse, a feeling that I came to realize existed ever since the death of my sweetheart." He violated scores of female corpses in the 2 years that he remained attached to the morgue, by practicing various perversions on them, ranging in age from infants to elderly women. He usually began by sucking their breasts and copulating his mouth to their privates, after which acts he would become so excited that he would crawl upon their bodies, and with superhuman effort he would perform the act of coitus. He has had as many as 4 or 5 acts a week of this nature, depending upon the number of female corpses in the morgue. On one occasion, he was so impressed with the corpse of a young girl 15 years of age that when alone with her the first night after her death, he drank some of her blood. This made him so sexually excited that he put a rubber tube up into the urethra, and with his mouth sucked the urine from her bladder. On this occasion he felt more and more of an urge to go further and felt that if he could only devour her, eat her up, even chew part of her body, it would give him great satisfaction. He was unable to resist this desire, and turning the body upon its face, he bit into the flesh of the buttocks near the rectum. He then crawled upon the cadaver and performed an act of sodomy on the corpse. U.P. de River, 1956. This case history is particularly interesting for several reasons. First and most obviously, because it combines necrophilia with necrophagia and anal eroticism. The other, less obvious point lies in the beginning of the perversion. If one knew the story only up to the death of his sweetheart, one might be prone to interpret his behavior as an expression of the intensity of his love. But the rest of the story throws a very different light on the beginning. One could hardly explain his indiscriminate necrophilous and necrophagous desires as being caused by the love for his sweetheart. One is forced to assume that his mourning behavior was not the expression of love, but the first symptom of his necrophilous desires. It would then also appear that the fact that he had sexual intercourse with his sweetheart only once is poorly rationalized by her illness. It is more likely that because of his necrophilous tendencies he had little desire for sexual intercourse with a live woman. De River gives another, less complex case history of a necrophilous morgue attendant. The subject is an unmarried man, aged 43, who states, at the age of 11, while a grave digger in Milan, Italy, I began masturbating, and when alone would do so while touching the bodies of the dead, young, good-looking women. Later I began inserting my penis into the dead girls. I came to America and left the East Coast after a short stay, and came to the West Coast where I secured a job washing bodies at a mortuary. Here I resumed my practice of having intercourse with dead girls, sometimes in the caskets or on the tables where the bodies are washed. The report continues. He admits using his mouth on the private parts, and sucking the breasts of young girl corpses. When asked how many women he has had, he states, maybe hundreds, as it has been going on since I was 11 years old. U.P. de River, 1956. The literature quoted by von Hentig reports many similar cases. A greatly attenuated form of necrophilia is to be found in individuals who become sexually excited by the sight of corpses and sometimes masturbate in front of them. The number of such persons can hardly be estimated because they are rarely discovered. The second form of necrophilia appears unalloyed with sex, in acts of the pure passion to destroy. Often this urge to destroy is already manifest in childhood. Sometimes it shows itself only at a later age. Von Hentig writes very sensitively that the aim of necrophilous destructiveness is the passion to tear apart living structures, lebendige Zusammenhänge. This desire to tear apart what is alive finds its clearest expression in a craving to dismember bodies. A typical case reported by Spory is that of a man going to the cemetery at night with all the necessary instruments, digging up the coffin, opening it, and taking the corpse with him to a place where he could hide it. He would then cut off the legs and the head and cut open the stomach. T. Spory, 1959. Sometimes the object of dismemberment is not a human being but an animal. Von Hentig tells about a man who stabbed 36 cows and mares to death and then cut off various parts of their bodies. But we hardly need the literature. There are enough newspaper reports about murders where the victim has been dismembered or mutilated. These cases are usually subsumed under the classification of murder, but they are committed by necrophilous murderers who are different from most murderers, whose motive is gain, jealousy, or revenge. The real aim of necrophilous murderers is not the death of the victim, which is, of course, a necessary condition, but the act of dismemberment. In my own clinical experience I have seen sufficient evidence that the desire for dismemberment is highly characteristic of the necrophilous character. For example, I have seen, directly or through supervision, several persons who expressed the desire for dismemberment in a very attenuated form. They would draw the figure of a nude woman, then cut out the arms, legs, head, etc., and play with these parts of the dismembered drawing. This play was in fact, however, the satisfaction of an intense craving for dismemberment acted out in a safe and harmless way. In many other necrophilous people I have observed that they had many dreams in which they saw parts of dismembered bodies floating or lying around, sometimes in blood, often in dirty water together with feces. The desire to dismember bodies, if it appears frequently in fantasies and dreams, is one of the most reliable factors for the diagnosis of the necrophilous character. No other act is as clear as expression of the desire to tear apart living structures. There are other, less drastic forms of overt necrophilia. One of them is the craving to be near corpses, cemeteries, or any object in decomposition. H.J. Rock tells of a girl who suffered from an urge to be close to corpses, in whose presence she would become rigid and unable to tear herself away. H.J. Rock, 1947. Steckel tells of a woman who stated, "I often think of cemeteries and of the manner in which corpses decay in the grave." Quoted by H. von Hentig, 1964. This interest in decay is frequently expressed in the craving to smell the odor of something that is decaying. This is very apparent in the following case of a 32-year-old, highly educated man who was almost totally blind. He was frightened of noise, but liked to hear women's cries of pain and loved the smell of decaying flesh. He had a craving for the corpses of tall, fat women and wanted to crawl into them. He asked his grandmother whether he could have her corpse later. He would like to drown in the decay of her remnants. T. Spory, 1959. Von Hentig speaks of sniffers, Schnuffier, for whom the smell of human excrement or of anything putrid is exciting, and he considers this trait a manifestation of necrophilia. With the addition of cases of necrophilous fetishism, the objects of which are connected with graves, such as grass, flowers, pictures, we can end this brief survey of necrophilous practices reported in the literature. The necrophilous character. The term necrophilous, to denote a character trait rather than a perverse act in the traditional sense, was used by the Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno in 1936 on the occasion of a speech by the nationalist General Milanestre at the University of Salamanca, where Unamuno was rector at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. The general's favorite motto was "Viva la Reine, long live death," and one of his followers shouted it from the back of the hall. When the general had finished his speech, Unamuno rose and said, "An unauthenticated story about Hitler describes a similar scene of his not being able to tear himself away from the sight of a decayed corpse of a soldier." In order to avoid misunderstandings, I want to stress at the outset of this discussion that describing here the full-grown necrophilous character does not imply that people are either necrophilous, or not. The necrophilous character is an extreme form in which necrophilia is the dominant trait. In reality, most people are a blend of necrophilous and biophilous tendencies, and the conflict between the two is often the source of a productive development. Lenin seems to have been the first to use the term necrophilia, trupologchestvo, in this psychological sense. V. Lenin, Sakainia. Just now I heard an necrophilous and senseless cry, "Long live death." And I, who have spent my life shaping paradoxes which have aroused the uncomprehending anger of others, I must tell you, as an expert authority, that this outlandish paradox is repellent to me. General Milanestre is a cripple. Let it be said without any slighting undertone. He is a war invalid. So was Cervantes. Unfortunately, there are too many cripples in Spain just now. And soon there will be even more of them if God does not come to our aid. It pains me to think that General Milanestre should dictate the pattern of mass psychology. A cripple who lacks the spiritual greatness of a Cervantes is wont to seek ominous relief in causing mutilation around him. M. de Unamuno, 1936. At this Milanestre was unable to restrain himself any longer. Down with intelligence! He shouted. "Long live death!"